English Traits by Ralph Waldo Emerson. 1856. English Traits by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Chapter 1. First Visit to England. I have been twice in England. In 1833, on my return from a short tour in Sicily, Italy, and France, I crossed from Boulogne, and landed in London at the Tower Stairs. It was a dark Sunday morning, there were few people in the streets, and I remember the pleasure of that first walk on English ground, with my companion, an American artist, from the Tower up through Cheapside and the Strand, to a house in Russell Square, whither we had been recommended to good chambers. For the first time for many months we were forced to check the saucy habit of travellers' criticism, as we could no longer speak aloud in the streets without being understood. The shop signs spoke our language, our country names were on the door plates, and the public and private buildings wore a more native and wonted front. Like most young men at that time, I was much indebted to the men of Edinburgh, and of the Edinburgh Review, to Geoffrey, Mackintosh, Hallam, and to Scott, Playfair, and De Quincey, and my narrow and desultory reading had inspired the wish to see the faces of 3 or 4 writers, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Landor, De Quincey, and the latest and strongest contributor to the critical journals, Carlyle, and I suppose if I had sifted the reasons that led me to Europe, when I was ill and was advised to travel, it was mainly the attraction of these persons. If Goethe had been still living, I might have wandered into Germany also. Besides those I have named, for Scott was dead, there was not in Britain the man living whom I cared to behold, unless it were the Duke of Wellington, whom I afterwards saw at Westminster Abbey, at the funeral of Wilberforce. The young scholar fancies it happiness enough to live with people who can give an insight to the world, without reflecting that they are prisoners, too, of their own thought, and cannot apply themselves to yours. The conditions of literary success are almost destructive of the best social power, as they do not leave that frolic liberty which only can encounter a companion on the best terms. It is probable you left some obscure comrade at a tavern, or in the farms, with right mother wit, and equality to life, when you crossed sea and land to play bo peep with celebrated scribes. I have, however, found writers 2. superior to their books, and I cling to my first belief, that a strong head will dispose fast enough of these impediments, and give one the satisfaction of reality, the sense of having been met, and a larger horizon. On looking over the diary of my journey in 1833, I find nothing to publish in my memoranda of visits to places. But I have copied the few notes I made of visits to persons, as they respect parties quite too good and too transparent to the whole world to make it needful to affect any prudery of suppression about a few hints of those bright personalities. At Florence, chief among artists I found Horatio Greenough, the American sculptor. His face was so handsome, and his person so well formed, that he might be pardoned, if, as was alleged, the face of his Medora, and the figure of a colossal Achilles in clay, were idealizations of his own. Greenough was a superior man, ardent and eloquent, and all his opinions had elevation and magnanimity. He believed that the Greeks had wrought in schools or fraternities, the genius of the master imparting his design to his friends, and inflaming them with it, and when his strength was spent, a new hand, with equal heat, continued the work, and so by relays, until it was finished in every part with equal fire. This was necessary in so refractory a material as stone, and he thought art would never prosper until we left our shy jealous ways, and worked in society as they. All his thoughts breathed the same generosity. He was an accurate and a deep man. He was a votary of the Greeks, and impatient of Gothic art. His paper on architecture, published in 1843, announced in advance the leading thoughts of Mr. Ruskin on the morality in architecture, notwithstanding the antagonism in their views of the history of art. I have a private letter from him, later, but respecting the same period, in which he roughly sketches his own theory. Here is my theory of structure, a scientific arrangement of spaces and forms to functions and to sight, an emphasis of features proportioned to their gradated importance in function, color and ornament to be decided and arranged and varied by strictly organic laws, having a distinct reason for each decision, the entire and immediate banishment of all makeshift and make-believe. Greenough brought me, through a common friend, an invitation from Mr. Landor, who lived at San Domenico di Fiesole. On the May 15 I dined with Mr. Landor. I found him noble and courteous, living in a 3. cloud of pictures at his Villa Gherardesca, a fine house commanding a beautiful landscape. I had inferred from his books, or magnified from some anecdotes, an impression of Achillean wrath, an untamable petulance. I do not know whether the imputation were just or not, but certainly on this May day his courtesy veiled that haughty mind, and he was the most patient and gentle of hosts. He praised the beautiful cyclamen which grows all about Florence, he admired Washington, talked of Wordsworth, Byron, Massinger, Beaumont, and Fletcher. To be sure, he is decided in his opinions, likes to surprise, and is well content to impress, if possible, his English whim upon the immutable past. No great man ever had a great son, if Philip and Alexander be not an exception, and Philip he calls the greater man. In art, he loves the Greeks, and in sculpture, them only. He prefers the Venus to everything else, and, after that, the head of Alexander, in the gallery here. He prefers John of Bologna to Michelangelo, in painting, Raphael, and shares the growing taste for Perugino and the early masters. The Greek histories he thought the only good, and after them, Voltaire's. I could not make him praise Mackintosh, nor my more recent friends, Montaigne very cordially, and Charon also, which seemed undiscriminating. He thought Degerando indebted to Lucas on happiness and Lucas on holiness. He pestered me with Southey, but who is Southey? He invited me to breakfast on Friday. On Friday I did not fail to go, and this time with Greenough. He entertained us at once with reciting half a dozen hexameter lines of Julius Caesar's. From Donatus, he said. He glorified Lord Chesterfield more than was necessary, and undervalued Burke, and undervalued Socrates, designated as three of the greatest of men, Washington, Phocion, and Timoleon, much as our pomologists, in their lists, select the 3 or the 6 best pears for a small orchard, and did not even omit to remark the similar termination of their names. A great man, he said, should make great sacrifices, and kill his 100 oxen, without knowing whether they would be consumed by gods and heroes, or whether the flies would eat them. I had visited Professor Amici, who had shown me his microscopes, magnifying, it was said, 2,000 diameters, and I spoke of the uses to which they were applied. Landor despised entomology, yet, in the same breath, said, the sublime was in a grain of dust. I suppose I teased him about recent writers, but he professed never to have heard of Herschel, not even by name. 1. 4. Room was full of pictures, which he likes to show, especially one piece, standing before which, he said he would give 50 guineas to the man that would swear it was a Domenichino. I was more curious to see his library, but Mr. H., one of the guests, told me that Mr. Landor gives away his books, and has never more than a dozen at a time in his house. Mr. Landor carries to its height the love of freak which the English delight to indulge, as if to signalize their commanding freedom. He has a wonderful brain, despotic, violent, and inexhaustible, meant for a soldier, by what chance converted to letters, in which there is not a style nor a tint not known to him, yet with an English appetite for action and heroes. The thing done avails, and not what is said about it. An original sentence, a step forward, is worth more than all the censures. Landor is strangely undervalued in England, usually ignored, and sometimes savagely attacked in the reviews. The criticism may be right, or wrong, and is quickly forgotten, but year after year the scholar must still go back to Landor for a multitude of elegant sentences for wisdom, wit, and indignation that are unforgettable. From London, on the August 5th, I went to Highgate, and wrote a note to Mr. Coleridge, requesting leave to pay my respects to him. It was near noon. Mr. Coleridge sent a verbal message, that he was in bed, but if I would call after 1 o'clock, he would see me. I returned at 1, and he appeared, a short, thick old man, with bright blue eyes and fine clear complexion, leaning on his cane. He took snuff freely, which presently soiled his cravat and neat black suit. He asked whether I knew Alston, and spoke warmly of his merits and doings when he knew him in Rome, what a master of the Titianesque he was, N.C. He spoke of Drive Channing. It was an unspeakable misfortune that he should have turned out a Unitarian after all. On this, he burst into a declamation on the folly and ignorance of Unitarianism, its high unreasonableness, and taking up Bishop Waterland's book, which lay on the table, he read with vehemence 2 or 3 pages written by himself in the fly-leaves, passages, too, which, I believe, are printed in the Aids to Reflection. When he stopped to take breath, I interposed, that, whilst I highly valued all his explanations, I was bound to tell him that I was born and bred a Unitarian. Yes, he said, I supposed so, and continued as before. It was a wonder, that after so many ages of unquestioning acquiescence in the doctrine of St. Paul, the doctrine of the Trinity, 5. Which was also, according to Philo-Judaeus, the doctrine of the Jews before Christ, this handful of Priscillians should take on themselves to deny it, N.C. He was very sorry that Dr. Channing, a man to whom he looked up, no, to say that he looked up to him would be to speak falsely, but a man whom he looked at with so much interest, should embrace such views. When he saw Dr. Channing, he had hinted to him that he was afraid he loved Christianity for what was lovely and excellent, he loved the good in it, and not the true, and I tell you, sir, that I have known 10 persons who loved the good, for 1 person who loved the true, but it is a far greater virtue to loveth the true for itself alone, than to love the good for itself alone. He, Coleridge, knew all about Unitarianism perfectly well, because he had once been a Unitarian, and knew what quackery it was. He had been called the rising star of Unitarianism. He went on defining, or rather refining, the Trinitarian doctrine was realism, the idea of God was not essential, but superessential, talked of trinism and tetrachism, and much more, of which I only caught this, that the will was that by which a person is a person, because, if one should push me in the street, and so I should force the man next me into the kennel, I should at once exclaim, I did not do it, sir, meaning it was not my will. And this also, that if you should insist on your faith here in England, and I on mine, mine would be the hotter side of the faggot. I took advantage of a pause to say, that he had many readers of all religious opinions in America, and I proceeded to inquire if the extract from the Independence pamphlet, in the 3rd volume of the Friend, were a veritable quotation. He replied, that it was really taken from a pamphlet in his possession, entitled A Protest of One of the Independents, or something to that effect. I told him how excellent I thought it, and how much I wished to see the entire work. Yes, he said, the man was a chaos of truths, but lacked the knowledge that God was a God of order. Yet the passage would no doubt strike you more in the quotation than in the original, for I have filtered it. When I rose to go, he said, I do not know whether you care about poetry, but I will repeat some verses I lately made on my baptismal anniversary, and he recited with strong emphasis, standing, 10 or 12 lines, beginning 6. Born unto God in Christ. He inquired where I had been travelling, and on learning that I had been in Malta and Sicily, he compared one island with the other, repeating what he had said to the Bishop of London when he returned from that country, that Sicily was an excellent school of political economy, for, in any town there, it only needed to ask what the government enacted, and reverse that to know what ought to be done. It was the most felicitously opposite legislation to anything good and wise. There were only 3 things which the government had brought into that garden of delights, namely, itch, pox, and famine. Whereas, in Malta, the force of law and mind was seen, in making that barren rock of semi-Saracen inhabitants the seat of population and plenty. Going out, he showed me in the next apartment a picture of Alston's, and told me that Montague, a picture dealer, once came to see him, and, glancing towards this, said, well, you have got a picture, thinking it the work of an old master." Afterwards, Montague, still talking with his back to the canvas, put up his hand and touched it, and exclaimed, "By heaven, this picture is not 10 years old, so delicate and skillful was that man's touch." I was in his company for about an hour, but find it impossible to recall the largest part of his discourse, which was often like so many printed paragraphs in his book, perhaps the same, so readily did he fall into certain commonplaces. As I might have foreseen, the visit was rather a spectacle than a conversation, of no use beyond the satisfaction of my curiosity. He was old and preoccupied, and could not bend to a new companion and think with him. From Edinburgh I went to the Highlands. On my return, I came from Glasgow to Dumfries, and being intent on delivering a letter which I had brought from Rome, inquired for Craigenputtoch. It was a farm in Nithsdale, in the parish of Dunscore, 16 miles distant. No public coach passed near it, so I took a private carriage from the inn. I found the house amid desolate heathery hills, where the lonely scholar nourished his mighty heart. Carlyle was a man from his youth, an author who did not need to hide from his readers, and as absolute a man of the world, unknown and exiled on that hill farm, as if holding on his own terms what is best in London. He was tall and gaunt, with a cliff-like brow, self-possessed, and holding his extraordinary powers of 7. Conversation in easy command, clinging to his northern accent with evident relish, full of lively anecdote, and with a streaming humour, which floated everything he looked upon. His talk playfully exalting the familiar objects, put the companion at once into an acquaintance with his Lars and lemurs, and it was very pleasant to learn what was predestined to be a pretty mythology. Few were the objects and lonely the man, not a person to speak to within 16 miles except the minister of Dunscore, so that books inevitably made his topics. He had names of his own for all the matters familiar to his discourse. Blackwood's was the Sand Magazine, Fraser's nearer approach to possibility of life was the Mud Magazine, a piece of road nearby that marked some failed enterprise was the grave of the last sixpence. When too much praise of any genius annoyed him, he professed hugely to admire the talent shown by his pig. He had spent much time and contrivance in confining the poor beast to one enclosure in his pen, but Pig, by great strokes of judgment, had found out how to let a board down, and had foiled him. For all that, he still thought man the most plastic little fellow in the planet, and he liked Nero's death, qualis artifex perio, better than most history. He worships a man that will manifest any truth to him. At one time he had inquired and read a good deal about America. Landor's principle was mere rebellion, and that he feared was the American principle. The best thing he knew of that country was, that in it a man can have meat for his labor. He had read in Stewart's book, that when he inquired in a New York hotel for the boots, he had been shown across the street and had found Mungo in his own house dining on roast turkey. We talked of books. Plato he does not read, and he disparaged Socrates, and, when pressed, persisted in making Mirabeau a hero. Gibbon he called the splendid bridge from the old world to the new. His own reading had been multifarious. Tristram Shandy was one of his first books after Robinson Crusoe, and Robertson's America an early favorite. Rousseau's Confessions had discovered to him that he was not a dunce, and it was now 10 years since he had learned German, by the advice of a man who told him he would find in that language what he wanted. He took despairing or satirical views of literature at this moment, recounted the incredible sums paid in 1 year by the great booksellers. 8. For puffing. Hence it comes that no newspaper is trusted now, no books are bought, and the booksellers are on the eve of bankruptcy. He still returned to English pauperism, the crowded country, the selfish abdication by public men of all that public persons should perform. Government should direct poor men what to do. Poor Irish folk come wandering over these moors. My dame makes it a rule to give to every son of Adam bread to eat, and supplies his wants to the next house. But here are thousands of acres which might give them all meat, and nobody to bid these poor Irish go to the moor and till it. They burned the stacks, and so found a way to force the rich people to attend to them. We went out to walk over long hills, and looked at Criffle then without his cap, and down into Wordsworth's country. There we sat down, and talked of the immortality of the soul. It was not Carlyle's fault that we talked on that topic, for he had the natural disinclination of every nimble spirit to bruise itself against walls, and did not like to place himself where no step can be taken. But he was honest and true, and cognizant of the subtle links that bind ages together, and saw how every event affects all the future. Christ died on the tree, that built Dunscore Kirk yonder, that brought you and me together. Time has only a relative existence. He was already turning his eyes towards London with a scholar's appreciation. London is the heart of the world, he said, wonderful only from the mass of human beings. He liked the huge machine. Each keeps its own round. The baker's boy brings muffins to the window at a fixed hour every day, and that is all the Londoner knows or wishes to know on the subject. But it turned out good men. He named certain individuals, especially one man of letters, his friend, the best mind he knew, whom London had well served. On the August 28th, I went to Rydal Mount, to pay my respects to M.R. Wordsworth. His daughters called in their father, a plain, elderly, white-haired man, not prepossessing, and disfigured by green goggles. He sat down, and talked with great simplicity. He had just returned from a journey. His health was good, but he had broken a tooth by a fall, when walking with two lawyers, and had said, that he was glad it did not happen 40 years ago, whereupon they had praised his philosophy. 9. He had much to say of America, the more that it gave occasion for his favorite topic, that society is being enlightened by a superficial tuition, out of all proportion to its being restrained by moral culture. Schools do no good. Tuition is not education. He thinks more of the education of circumstances than of tuition. 'Tis not question whether there are offences of which the law takes cognizance, but whether there are offences of which the law does not take cognizance. Sin is what he fears, and how society is to escape without gravest mischiefs from this source. He has even said, what seemed a paradox, that they needed a civil war in America, to teach the necessity of knitting the social ties stronger. There may be, he said, in America some vulgarity in manner, but that's not important. That comes of the pioneer state of things. But I fear they are too much given to the making of money, and secondly, to politics, that they make political distinction the end, and not the means. And I fear they lack a class of men of leisure, in short, of gentlemen, to give a tone of honor to the community. I am told that things are boasted of in the second class of society there, which, in England, God knows, are done in England every day, but would never be spoken of. In America I wish to know not how many churches or schools, but what newspapers. My friend, Colonel Hamilton, at the foot of the hill, who was a year in America, assures me that the newspapers are atrocious, and accuse members of Congress of stealing spoons. He was against taking off the tax on newspapers in England, which the reformers represent as a tax upon knowledge, for this reason, that they would be inundated with base prints. He said, he talked on political aspects, for he wished to impress on me and all good Americans to cultivate the moral, the conservative, NC, and never to call into action the physical strength of the people, as had just now been done in England in the Reform Bill, a thing prophesied by de Lolme. He alluded once or twice to his conversation with Dr. Channing, who had recently visited him, laying his hand on a particular chair in which the doctor had Saturday. The conversation turned on books. Lucretius he esteems a far higher poet than Virgil, not in his system, which is nothing, but in his power of illustration. Faith is necessary to explain anything, and to reconcile the foreknowledge of God with human evil. Of Cousin, whose lectures we had all been reading in Boston, he knew only the name. 10. I inquired if he had read Carlyle's critical articles and translations. He said, he thought him sometimes insane. He proceeded to abuse Goethe's Wilhelm Meister heartily. It was full of all manner of fornication. It was like the crossing of flies in the air. He had never gone farther than the first part, so disgusted was he that he threw the book across the room. I deprecated this wrath, and said what I could for the better parts of the book, and he courteously promised to look at it again. Carlyle, he said, wrote most obscurely. He was clever and deep, but he defied the sympathies of everybody. Even Mr. Coleridge wrote more clearly, though he had always wished Coleridge would write more to be understood. He led me out into his garden, and showed me the gravel walk in which thousands of his lines were composed. His eyes are much inflamed. This is no loss, except for reading, because he never writes prose, and of poetry he carries even hundreds of lines in his head before writing them. He had just returned from a visit to Staffa, and within 3 days had made 3 sonnets on Fingal's Cave, and was composing a 4th, when he was called in to see me. He said, "If you are interested in my verses, perhaps you will like to hear these lines." I gladly assented, and he recollected himself for a few moments, and then stood forth and repeated, one after the other, the 3 entire sonnets with great animation. I fancied the 2nd and 3rd more beautiful than his poems are wont to be. The 3rd is addressed to the flowers, which, he said, especially the ox-eye daisy, are very abundant on the top of the rock. The 2nd alludes to the name of the cave, which is Cave of Music, the 1st to the circumstance of its being visited by the promiscuous company of the steamboat. This recitation was so unlooked for and surprising, he, the old Wordsworth, standing apart, and reciting to me in a garden walk, like a schoolboy declaiming, that I at first was near to laugh, but recollecting myself, that I had come thus far to see a poet, and he was chanting poems to me, I saw that he was right and I was wrong, and gladly gave myself up to hear. I told him how much the few printed extracts had quickened the desire to possess his unpublished poems. He replied, he never was in haste to publish, partly, because he corrected a good deal, and every alteration is ungraciously received after printing, but what he had written would be printed, whether he lived or died. I said, Tintern Abbey appeared to be the favourite poem with the public, but more. 11. Contemplative readers preferred the first books of the Excursion, and the sonnets. He said, yes, they are better. He preferred such of his poems as touched the affections, to any others, for whatever is didactic, what theories of society, and so on, might perish quickly, but whatever combined a truth with an affection was ctima esaei, good today and good forever. He cited the sonnet on the feelings of a high-minded Spaniard, which he preferred to any other, I so understood him, and the 2 voices, and quoted, with evident pleasure, the verses addressed to the skylark. In this connection, he said of the Newtonian theory, that it might yet be superseded and forgotten, and Dalton's atomic theory. When I prepared to depart, he said he wished to show me what a common person in England could do, and he led me into the enclosure of his clerk, a young man, to whom he had given this slip of ground, which was laid out, or its natural capabilities shown, with much taste. He then said he would show me a better way towards the inn, and he walked a good part of a mile, talking, and ever and anon stopping short to impress the word or the verse, and finally parted from me with great kindness, and returned across the fields. Wordsworth honoured himself by his simple adherence to truth, and was very willing not to shine, but he surprised by the hard limits of his thought. To judge from a single conversation, he made the impression of a narrow and very English mind, of one who paid for his rare elevation by general tameness and conformity. Off his own beat, his opinions were of no value. It is not very rare to find persons loving sympathy and ease, who expiate their departure from the common, in one direction, by their conformity in every other. 12. Chapter 2. Voyage to England. The occasion of my second visit to England was an invitation from some mechanics' institutes in Lancashire and Yorkshire, which separately are organised much in the same way as our New England lyceums, but, in 1847, had been linked into a union, which embraced 20 or 30 towns and cities, and presently extended into the middle counties, and northward into Scotland. I was invited, on liberal terms, to read a series of lectures in them all. The request was urged with every kind suggestion, and every assurance of aid and comfort, by friendliest parties in Manchester, who, in the sequel, amply redeemed their word. The remuneration was equivalent to the fees at that time paid in this country for the like services. At all events, it was sufficient to cover any travelling expenses, and the proposal offered an excellent opportunity of seeing the interior of England and Scotland, by means of a home, and a committee of intelligent friends, awaiting me in every town. I did not go very willingly. I am not a good traveller, nor have I found that long journeys yield a fair share of reasonable hours. But the invitation was repeated and pressed at a moment of more leisure, and when I was a little spent by some unusual studies. I wanted a change and a tonic, and England was proposed to me. Besides, there were, at least, the dread attraction and salutary influences of the sea. So I took my berth in the packet ship Washington Irving, and sailed from Boston on Tuesday, October 5, 1847. On Friday at noon, we had only made 134 miles. A nimble Indian would have swum as far, but the captain affirmed that the ship would show us in time all her paces, and we crept along through the floating drift of boards, logs, and chips, which the rivers of Maine and New Brunswick pour into the sea after a freshet. At last, on Sunday night, after doing one day's work in 4, the storm came, the winds blew, and we flew before a northwester, which strained every rope and sail. The good ship darts through the water all day, all night, like a fish, quivering with speed, gliding through liquid leagues, sliding from horizon to horizon. She has passed Cape Sable, she has 13. Reached the banks, the land birds are left, gulls, hagults, ducks, petrels, swim, dive, and hover around, no fishermen. She has passed the banks, left 5 sail behind her, far on the edge of the west at sundown, which were far east of us at morn, though they say at sea a stern chase is a long race, and still we fly for our lives. The shortest sea line from Boston to Liverpool is 2,850 miles. This a steamer keeps, and saves 150 miles. A sailing ship can never go in a shorter line than 3,000, and usually it is much longer. Our good master keeps his kites up to the last moment, studding sails alow and aloft, and, by incessant straight steering, never loses a rod of way. Watchfulness is the law of the ship, watch on watch, for advantage and for life. Since the ship was built, it seems, the master never slept but in his day clothes whilst on board. There are many advantages, says Sati, in sea voyaging, but security is not one of them. Yet in hurrying over these abysses, whatever dangers we are running into, we are certainly running out of the risks of hundreds of miles every day, which have their own chances of squall, collision, sea stroke, piracy, cold, and thunder. Hour for hour, the risk on a steamboat is greater, but the speed is safety, or 12 days of danger, instead of 24. Our ship was registered 750 tons, and weighed perhaps, with all her freight, 1,500 tons. The mainmast, from the deck to the top button, measured 115 feet, the length of the deck, from stem to stern, 155. It is impossible not to personify a ship, everybody does, in everything they say. She behaves well, she minds her rudder, she swims like a duck, she runs her nose into the water, she looks into a port. Then that wonderful esprit du corps, by which we adopt into our self-love everything we touch, makes us all champions of her sailing qualities. The conscious ship hears all the praise. In 1 week she has made 1,467 miles, and now, at night, seems to hear the steamer behind her, which left Boston today at 2, has mended her speed, and is flying before the grey south wind 11½ knots the hour. The sea fire shines in her wake, and far around wherever a wave breaks. I read the hour, 9h. 45, on my watch by this light. Near the equator, you can read small print by it, and the mate describes the phosphoric insects, when taken up in a pail, as shaped like a Carolina potato. 14. I find the sea life an acquired taste, like that for tomatoes and olives. The confinement, cold, motion, noise, and odor are not to be dispensed with. The floor of your room is sloped at an angle of 20 or 30 degrees, and I waked every morning with the belief that someone was tipping up my berth. Nobody likes to be treated ignominiously, upset, shoved against the side of the house, rolled over, suffocated with bilge, mephitis, and stewing oil. We get used to these annoyances at last, but the dread of the sea remains longer. The sea is masculine, the type of active strength. Look, what eggshells are drifting all over it, each one, like ours, filled with men in ecstasies of terror, alternating with cockney conceit, as the sea is rough or smooth. Is this sad-colored circle an eternal cemetery? In our graveyards we scoop a pit, but this aggressive water opens mile-wide pits and chasms, and makes a mouthful of a fleet. To the geologist, the sea is the only firmament, the land is in perpetual flux and change, now blown up like a tumor, now sunk in a chasm, and the registered observations of a few hundred years find it in a perpetual tilt, rising and falling. The sea keeps its old level, and 'tis no wonder that the history of our race is so recent, if the roar of the ocean is silencing our traditions. A rising of the sea, such as has been observed, say an inch in a century, from east to west on the land, will bury all the towns, monuments, bones, and knowledge of mankind, steadily and insensibly. If it is capable of these great and secular mischiefs, it is quite as ready at private and local damage, and of this no landsman seems so fearful as the seaman. Such discomfort and such danger as the narratives of the captain and mate disclose are bad enough as the costly fee we pay for entrance to Europe, but the wonder is always new that any sane man can be a sailor. And here, on the second day of our voyage, stepped out a little boy in his shirt sleeves, who had hid himself, whilst the ship was in port, in the bread closet, having no money, and wishing to go to England. The sailors have dressed him in Guernsey frock, with a knife in his belt, and he is climbing nimbly about after them, likes the work first rate, and, if the captain will take him, means now to come back again in the ship. The mate avers that this is the history of all sailors, 9 out of 10 are runaway boys, and adds, that all of them are sick of the sea, but stay in it out of pride. Jack has a life of risks, incessant abuse, and the worst pay. It is a little better with the mate, and not very much better with the captain. $100 a month is reckoned high pay. If sailors were 15. Contented, if they had not resolved again and again not to go to sea any more, I should respect them. Of course, the inconveniences and terrors of the sea are not of any account to those whose minds are preoccupied. The water laws, Arctic frost, the mountain, the mine, only shatter cockneyism. Every noble activity makes room for itself. A great mind is a good sailor, as a great heart is. And the sea is not slow in disclosing inestimable secrets to a good naturalist. 'Tis a good rule in every journey to provide some piece of liberal study to rescue the hours which bad weather, bad company, and taverns steal from the best economist. Classics which at home are drowsily read have a strange charm in a country inn, or in the transom of a merchant brig. I remember that some of the happiest and most valuable hours I have owed to books, passed, many years ago, on shipboard. The worst impediment I have found at sea is the want of light in the cabin. We found on board the usual cabin library. Basil Hall, Dumas, Dickens, Bulwer, Balzac, and Sand were our sea gods. Among the passengers, there was some variety of talent and profession. We exchanged our experiences, and all learned something. The busiest talk with leisure and convenience at sea, and sometimes a memorable fact turns up, which you have long had a vacant niche for, and seize with the joy of a collector. But, under the best conditions, a voyage is one of the severest tests to try a man. A college examination is nothing to it. Sea days are long, these lackluster, joyless days which whistled over us, but they were few, only 15, as the captain counted, 16 according to me. Reckoned from the time when we left soundings, our speed was such that the captain drew the line of his course in red ink on his chart, for the encouragement or envy of future navigators. It has been said that the King of England would consult his dignity by giving audience to foreign ambassadors in the cabin of a man of war. And I think the white path of an Atlantic ship the right avenue to the palace front of this seafaring people, who for hundreds of years claimed the strict sovereignty of the sea, and exacted toll and the striking sail from the ships of all other peoples. When their privilege was disputed by the Dutch and other junior marines, on the plea that you could never anchor on the same wave, or hold property in what was always flowing. 16. The English did not stick to claim the channel, or bottom of all the main. As if, said they, we contended for the drops of the sea, and not for its situation, or the bed of those waters. The sea is bounded by His Majesty's empire. As we neared the land, its genius was felt. This was inevitably the British side. In every man's thought arises now a new system, English sentiments, English loves and fears, English history and social modes. Yesterday, every passenger had measured the speed of the ship by watching the bubbles over the ship's bulwarks. Today, instead of bubbles, we measure by Kinsale, Cork, Waterford and Ardmore. There lay the green shore of Ireland, like some coast of plenty. We could see towns, towers, churches, harvests, but the curse of 800 years we could not discern. 17. Chapter 3. Land. Alfieri thought Italy and England the only countries worth living in, the former, because their nature vindicates her rights, and triumphs over the evils inflicted by the governments, the latter, because art conquers nature, and transforms a rude, ungenial land into a paradise of comfort and plenty. England is a garden. Under an ash-colored sky, the fields have been combed and rolled till they appear to have been finished with a pencil instead of a plough. The solidity of the structures that compose the towns speaks the industry of ages. Nothing is left as it was made. Rivers, hills, valleys, the sea itself feel the hand of a master. The long habitation of a powerful and ingenious race has turned every root of land to its best use, has found all the capabilities, the arable soil, the quarryable rock, the highways, the byways, the forts, the navigable waters, and the new arts of intercourse meet you everywhere, so that England is a huge phalanstery, where all that man wants is provided within the precinct. Cushioned and comforted in every manner, the traveller rides as on a cannonball, high and low, over rivers and towns, through mountains, in tunnels of 3 or 4 miles, at near twice the speed of our trains, and reads quietly the Times newspaper, which, by its immense correspondence and reporting, seems to have machinized the rest of the world for his occasion. The problem of the traveller landing at Liverpool is, why England is England? What are the elements of that power which the English hold over other nations? If there be one test of national genius universally accepted, it is success, and if there be one successful country in the universe for the last millennium, that country is England. A wise traveller will naturally choose to visit the best of actual nations, and an American has more reasons than another to draw him to Britain. In all that is done or begun by the Americans towards right thinking or practice, we are met by a civilization already settled and overpowering. The culture of the day, the thoughts and aims of men, are English thoughts and aims. A nation considerable for 1,000 years since Egbert, it has, in the last centuries, obtained the ascendant, and stamped the knowledge, activity, and power of mankind with its impress. Those 18. Who resist it do not feel it or obey it less. The Russian in his snows is aiming to be English. The Turk and Chinese also are making awkward efforts to be English. The practical common sense of modern society, the utilitarian direction which labor, laws, opinion, religion take, is the natural genius of the British mind. The influence of France is a constituent of modern civility, but not enough opposed to the English for the most wholesome effect. The American is only the continuation of the English genius into new conditions, more or less propitious. See what books fill our libraries. Every book we read, every biography, play, romance, in whatever form, is still English history and manners. So that a sensible Englishman once said to me, "As long as you do not grant us copyright, we shall have the teaching of you." But we have the same difficulty in making a social or moral estimate of England, as the sheriff finds in drawing a jury to try some cause which has agitated the whole community, and on which everybody finds himself an interested party. Officers, jurors, judges have all taken sides. England has inoculated all nations with her civilization, intelligence, and tastes, and, to resist the tyranny and prepossession of the British element, a serious man must aid himself, by comparing with it the civilizations of the farthest east and west, the old Greek, the Oriental, and, much more, the ideal standard, if only by means of the very impatience which English forms are sure to awaken in independent minds. Besides, if we will visit London, the present time is the best time, as some signs portend that it has reached its highest point. It is observed that the English interest us a little less within a few years, and hence the impression that the British power has culminated, is in solstice, or already declining. As soon as you enter England, which, with Wales, is no larger than the state of Georgia, this little land stretches by an illusion to the dimensions of an empire. The innumerable details, the crowded succession of towns, cities, cathedrals, castles, and great and decorated estates, the number and power of the trades and guilds, the military strength and splendor, the multitudes of rich and of remarkable people. One add South Carolina, and you have more than an equivalent for the area of Scotland. 19. The servants and equipages, all these catching the eye, and never allowing it to pause, hide all boundaries, by the impression of magnificence and endless wealth. I reply to all the urgencies that refer me to this and that object indispensably to be seen, yes, to see England well needs 100 years, for, what they told me was the merit of Sir John Soane's Museum, in London, that it was well packed and well saved, is the merit of England. It is stuffed full, in all corners and crevices, with towns, towers, churches, villas, palaces, hospitals, and charity houses. In the history of art, it is a long way from a cromlech to York Minster, yet all the intermediate steps may still be traced in this all-preserving island. The territory has a singular perfection. The climate is warmer by many degrees than it is entitled to by latitude. Neither hot nor cold, there is no hour in the whole year when one cannot work. Here is no winter, but such days as we have in Massachusetts in November, a temperature which makes no exhausting demand on human strength, but allows the attainment of the largest stature. Charles II said, it invited men abroad more days in the year and more hours in the day than another country. Then England has all the materials of a working country except wood. The constant rain, a rain with every tide, in some parts of the island, keeps its multitude of rivers full, and brings agricultural production up to the highest point. It has plenty of water, of stone, of potter's clay, of coal, of salt, and of iron. The land naturally abounds with game. Immense heaths and downs are paved with quails, grouse, and woodcock, and the shores are animated by water birds. The rivers and the surrounding sea spawn with fish. There are salmon for the rich, and sprats and herrings for the poor. In the northern lochs, the herring are in innumerable shoals. At one season, the country people say, the lakes contain 1 part water and 2 parts fish. The only drawback on this industrial conveniency, is the darkness of its sky. The night and day are too nearly of a color. It strains the eyes to read and to write. Add the coal smoke. In the manufacturing towns, the fine soot or blacks darken the day, give white sheep the color of black sheep, discolor the human saliva, contaminate the air, poison many plants, and corrode the monuments and buildings. 20. The London fog aggravates the distempers of the sky, and sometimes justifies the epigram on the climate by an English wit: in a fine day, looking up a chimney; in a foul day, looking down one. A gentleman in Liverpool told me that he found he could do without a fire in his parlour about 1 day in the year. It is however pretended, that the enormous consumption of coal in the island is also felt in modifying the general climate. Factitious climate, factitious position. England resembles a ship in its shape, and, if it were one, its best admiral could not have worked it, or anchored it in a more judicious or effective position. Sir John Herschel said, London was the center of the terrene globe. The shopkeeping nation, to use a shop word, has a good stand. The old Venetians pleased themselves with the flattery, that Venice was in 45 degrees, midway between the poles and the line, as if that were an imperial centrality. Long of old, the Greeks fancied Delphi the navel of the earth, in their favorite mode of fabling the earth to be an animal. The Jews believed Jerusalem to be the center. I have seen a chronometric chart designed to show that the city of Philadelphia was in the same thermic belt, and, by inference, in the same belt of empire, as the cities of Athens, Rome, and London. It was drawn by a patriotic Philadelphian, and was examined with pleasure, under his showing, by the inhabitants of Chestnut Street. But, when carried to Charleston, to New Orleans, and to Boston, it somehow failed to convince the ingenious scholars of all those capitals. But England is anchored at the side of Europe, and right in the heart of the modern world. The sea, which, according to Virgil's famous line, divided the poor Britons utterly from the world, proved to be the ring of marriage with all nations. It is not down in the books, it is written only in the geologic strata, that fortunate day when a wave of the German Ocean burst the old isthmus which joined Kent and Cornwall to France, and gave to this fragment of Europe its impregnable sea wall, cutting off an island of 800 miles in length, with an irregular breadth reaching to 300 miles, a territory large enough for independence enriched with every seed of national power, so near, that it can see the harvests of the continent, and so far, that who would cross the strait must be an expert mariner, ready for tempests. As America, Europe, and Asia lie, these Britons have precisely the best commercial position in the whole planet, and are sure of a market for all the goods. 21. They can manufacture. And to make these advantages avail, the river Thames must dig its spacious outlet to the sea from the heart of the kingdom, giving road and landing to innumerable ships, and all the conveniency to trade, that a people so skillful and sufficient in economizing waterfront by docks, warehouses, and lighters required. When James I declared his purpose of punishing London by removing his court, the Lord Mayor replied, that, in removing his royal presence from his lieges, they hoped he would leave them the Thames. In the variety of surface, Britain is a miniature of Europe, having plain, forest, marsh, river, seashore, mines in Cornwall, caves in Matlock and Derbyshire, delicious landscape in Dovedale, delicious sea view at Tor Bay, highlands in Scotland, Snowdon in Wales, and, in Westmoreland and Cumberland, a pocket Switzerland, in which the lakes and mountains are on a sufficient scale to fill the eye and touch the imagination. It is a nation conveniently small. Fontenelle thought, that nature had sometimes a little affectation, and there is such an artificial completeness in this nation of artificers, as if there were a design from the beginning to elaborate a bigger Birmingham. Nature held counsel with herself, and said, "My Romans are gone. To build my new empire, I will choose a rude race, all masculine, with brutish strength. I will not grudge a competition of the roughest males. Let buffalo gore buffalo, and the pasture to the strongest. For I have work that requires the best wool and sinew. Sharp and temperate northern breezes shall blow, to keep that will alive and alert. The sea shall disjoin the people from others, and knit them to a fierce nationality. It shall give them markets on every side. Long time I will keep them on their feet, by poverty, border wars, seafaring, sea risks, and the stimulus of gain. An island, but not so large, the people not so many as to glut the great markets and depress one another, but proportioned to the size of Europe and the continents. With its fruits and wares and money, must its civil influence radiate. It is a singular coincidence to this geographic centrality, the spiritual centrality, which Emanuel Swedenborg ascribes to the people. 22. For the English nation, the best of them are in the center of all Christians, because they have interior intellectual light. This appears conspicuously in the spiritual world. This light they derive from the liberty of speaking and writing, and thereby of thinking. 23. Chapter 4. Race. An ingenious anatomist has written a book to prove that races are imperishable, but nations are pliant political constructions, easily changed or destroyed. But this writer did not found his assumed races on any necessary law, disclosing their ideal or metaphysical necessity, nor did he, on the other hand, count with precision the existing races, and settle the true bounds, a point of nicety, and the popular test of the theory. The individuals at the extremes of divergence in one race of men are as unlike as the wolf to the lapdog. Yet each variety shades down imperceptibly into the next, and you cannot draw the line where a race begins or ends. Hence every writer makes a different count. Blumenbach reckons 5 races, Humboldt 3, and Mr. Pickering, who lately, in our exploring expedition, thinks he saw all the kinds of men that can be on the planet, makes 11. The British Empire is reckoned to contain 222 million souls, perhaps a fifth of the population of the globe, and to comprise a territory of 5 million square miles. So far have British people predominated. Perhaps 40 of these millions are of British stock. Add the United States of America, which reckon, exclusive of slaves, 20 million of people, on a territory of 3 million square miles, and in which the foreign element, however considerable, is rapidly assimilated, and you have a population of English descent and language, of 60 million, and governing a population of 245 million souls. The British census proper reckons 27.5 millions in the home countries. What makes this census important is the quality of the units that compose it. They are free forcible men, in a country where life is safe, and has reached the greatest value. They give the bias to the current age, and that, not by chance or by mass, but by their character, and by the number of individuals among them of personal ability. It has been denied that the English have genius. Be it as it may, men of vast intellect have been born on their soil, and they have made or applied the principal inventions. They have sound bodies, and supreme endurance in. To the Races, a Fragment. By Robert Knox. London, 1850. 24. War and in Labour. The spawning force of the race has sufficed to the colonization of great parts of the world, yet it remains to be seen whether they can make good the exodus of millions from Great Britain, amounting, in 1852, to more than 1,000 a day. They have assimilating force, since they are imitated by their foreign subjects, and they are still aggressive and propagandist, enlarging the dominion of their arts and liberty. Their laws are hospitable, and slavery does not exist under them. What oppression exists is incidental and temporary, their success is not sudden or fortunate, but they have maintained constancy and self-equality for many ages. Is this power due to their race, or to some other cause? Men hear gladly of the power of blood or race. Everybody likes to know that his advantages cannot be attributed to air, soil, sea, or to local wealth as mines and quarries, nor to laws and traditions, nor to fortune, but to superior brain, as it makes the praise more personal to him. We anticipate in the doctrine of race something like that law of physiology, that, whatever bone, muscle, or essential organ is found in one healthy individual, the same part or organ may be found in or near the same place in its congener, and we look to find in the son every mental and moral property that existed in the ancestor. In race, it is not the broad shoulders or litheness or stature that give advantage, but a symmetry that reaches as far as to the wit. Then the miracle and renown begin. Then first we care to examine the pedigree, and copy heedfully the training, what food they ate, what nursing, school, and exercises they had, which resulted in this mother wit, delicacy of thought, and robust wisdom. How came such men as King Alfred, and Roger Bacon, William of Wykeham, Walter Raleigh, Philip Sidney, Isaac Newton, William Shakespeare, George Chapman, Francis Bacon, George Herbert, Henry Vane, to exist here? What made these delicate natures? Was it the air? Was it the sea? Was it the parentage? For it is certain that these men are samples of their contemporaries. The hearing ear is always found close to the speaking tongue, and no genius can long or often utter anything which is not invited and gladly entertained by men around him. It is race, is it not? That puts the 100 millions of India under the dominion of a remote island in the north of Europe. Race avails much, if that be true, which is alleged, that all Celts are Catholics, and all Saxons. 25. Are Protestants, that Celts love unity of power, and Saxons the representative principle. Race is a controlling influence in the Jew, who, for 2 millenniums, under every climate, has preserved the same character and employments. Race in the Negro is of appalling importance. The French in Canada, cut off from all intercourse with the parent people, have held their national traits. I chanced to read Tacitus on the manners of the Germans, not long since, in Missouri, and the heart of Illinois, and I found abundant points of resemblance between the Germans of the Hercynian forest, and our Hoosiers, suckers, and badgers of the American woods. But whilst race works immortally to keep its own, it is resisted by other forces. Civilization is a reagent, and eats away the old traits. The Arabs of today are the Arabs of Pharaoh, but the Briton of today is a very different person from Cassibellanus or Ossian. Each religious sect has its physiognomy. The Methodists have acquired a face, the Quakers, a face, the nuns, a face. An Englishman will pick out a dissenter by his manners. Trades and professions carve their own lines on face and form. Certain circumstances of English life are not less effective, as personal liberty, plenty of food, good ale and mutton, open market, or good wages for every kind of labor, high bribes to talent and skill, the island life, or the million opportunities and outlets for expanding and misplaced talent, readiness of combination among themselves for politics or for business, strikes, and sense of superiority founded on habit of victory in labor and in war, and the appetite for superiority grows by feeding. It is easy to add to the counteracting forces to race. Credence is a main element. 'Tis said, that the views of nature held by any people determine all their institutions. Whatever influences add to mental or moral faculty, take men out of nationality, as out of other conditions, and make the national life a culpable compromise. These limitations of the formidable doctrine of race suggest others which threaten to undermine it, as not sufficiently based. The fixity or inconvertibleness of races as we see them, is a weak argument for the eternity of these frail boundaries, since all our historical period is a point to the duration in which nature has wrought. Any the least and solitariest fact in our natural history, such as the melioration of fruits and of animal stocks, has the worth of a power in the opportunity of geologic periods. 26. Moreover, though we flatter the self-love of men and nations by the legend of pure races, all our experiences of the gradation and resolution of races, and strange resemblances meet us everywhere. It need not puzzle us that Malay and Papuan, Celt and Roman, Saxon and Tartar should mix, when we see the rudiments of tiger and baboon in our human form, and know that the barriers of races are not so firm, but that some spray sprinkles us from the antediluvian seas. The low organizations are simplest, a mere mouth, a jelly, or a straight worm. As the scale mounts, the organizations become complex. We are piqued with pure descent, but nature loves inoculation. A child blends in his face the faces of both parents, and some feature from every ancestor whose face hangs on the wall. The best nations are those most widely related, and navigation, as affecting a worldwide mixture, is the most potent advancer of nations. The English composite character betrays a mixed origin. Everything English is a fusion of distant and antagonistic elements. The language is mixed, the names of men are of different nations, 3 languages, 3 or 4 nations, the currents of thought are counter, contemplation and practical skill, active intellect and dead conservatism, worldwide enterprise, and devoted use and wont, aggressive freedom and hospitable law, with bitter class legislation, a people scattered by their wars and affairs over the face of the whole earth, and homesick to a man, a country of extremes, dukes and chartists. Bishops of Durham and naked heathen colliers, nothing can be praised in it without damning exceptions, and nothing denounced without salvos of cordial praise. Neither do this people appear to be of one stem, but collectively a better race than any from which they are derived. Nor is it easy to trace it home to its original seats. Who can call by right names what races are in Britain? Who can trace them historically? Who can discriminate them anatomically, or metaphysically? In the impossibility of arriving at satisfaction on the historical question of race, and, come of whatever disputable ancestry, the indisputable Englishman before me, himself very well marked, and nowhere else to be found, I fancied I could leave quite aside the choice of a tribe as his lineal progenitors. Defoe said in his wrath, the Englishman was the mud. 27. Of all races, I incline to the belief, that, as water, lime, and sand make mortar, so certain temperaments marry well, and, by well-managed contrarieties, develop as drastic a character as the English. On the whole, it is not so much a history of one or of certain tribes of Saxons, Jutes, or Frisians, coming from one place, and genetically identical, as it is an anthology of temperaments out of them all. Certain temperaments suit the sky and soil of England, say 8 or 10 or 20 varieties, as, out of 100 pear trees, 8 or 10 suit the soil of an orchard, and thrive, whilst all the unadapted temperaments die out. The English derive their pedigree from such a range of nationalities, that there needs sea room and land room to unfold the varieties of talent and character. Perhaps the ocean serves as a galvanic battery to distribute acids at one pole, and alkalis at the other. So England tends to accumulate her liberals in America, and her conservatives at London. The Scandinavians in her race still hear in every age the murmurs of their mother, the ocean. The Briton in the blood hugs the homestead still. Again, as if to intensate the influences that are not of race, what we think of when we talk of English traits really narrows itself to a small district. It excludes Ireland, and Scotland, and Wales, and reduces itself at last to London, that is, to those who come and go thither. The portraits that hang on the walls in the Academy exhibition at London, the figures in Punch's drawings of the public men, or of the club houses, the prints in the shop windows, are distinctive English, and not American, no, nor Scotch, nor Irish, but 'tis a very restricted nationality. As you go north into the manufacturing and agricultural districts, and to the population that never travels, as you go into Yorkshire, as you enter Scotland, the world's Englishman is no longer found. In Scotland, there is a rapid loss of all grandeur of mien and manners, a provincial eagerness and acuteness appear, the poverty of the country makes itself remarked, and a coarseness of manners, and, among the intellectual, is the insanity of dialectics. In Ireland, are the same climate and soil as in England, but less food, no right relation to the land, political dependence, small tenantry, and an inferior or misplaced race. These queries concerning ancestry and blood may be well allowed, for there is no prosperity that seems more to depend on the kind of man than British prosperity. Only a hardy and wise people could have made 28. This small territory great. We say, in a regatta or yacht race, that if the boats are anywhere nearly matched, it is the man that wins. Put the best sailing master into either boat, and he will win. Yet it is fine for us to speculate in face of unbroken traditions, though vague, and losing themselves in fable. The traditions have got footing, and refuse to be disturbed. The kitchen clock is more convenient than sidereal time. We must use the popular category, as we do by the Linnean classification, for convenience, and not as exact and final. Otherwise, we are presently confounded, when the best settled traits of one race are claimed by some new ethnologist as precisely characteristic of the rival tribe. I found plenty of well-marked English types, the ruddy complexion fair and plump, robust men, with faces cut like a die, and a strong island speech and accent, a Norman type, with the complacency that belongs to that constitution. Others, who might be Americans, for anything that appeared in their complexion or form, and their speech was much less marked, and their thought much less bound. We will call them Saxons. Then the Roman has implanted his dark complexion in the trinity or quaternity of bloods. 1. The sources from which tradition derives their stock are mainly 3. And, first, they are of the oldest blood of the world, the Celtic. Some peoples are deciduous or transitory. Where are the Greeks? Where the Etrurians? Where the Romans? But the Celts or Sidonides are an old family, of whose beginning there is no memory, and their end is likely to be still more remote in the future, for they have endurance and productiveness. They planted Britain, and gave to the seas and mountains names which are poems, and imitate the pure voices of nature. They are favorably remembered in the oldest records of Europe. They had no violent feudal tenure, but the husbandman owned the land. They had an alphabet, astronomy, priestly culture, and a sublime creed. They have a hidden and precarious genius. They made the best popular literature of the Middle Ages in the songs of Merlin, and the tender and delicious mythology of Arthur. 2. The English come mainly from the Germans, whom the Romans found hard to conquer in 210 years, say, impossible to conquer, when one remembers the long sequel, a people about whom. 29. In the old empire, the rumor ran, there was never any that meddled with them that repented it not. 3. Charlemagne, halting one day in a town of Narbonnese Gaul, looked out of a window, and saw a fleet of Northmen cruising in the Mediterranean. They even entered the port of the town where he was, causing no small alarm and sudden manning and arming of his galleys. As they put out to sea again, the emperor gazed long after them, his eyes bathed in tears. I am tormented with sorrow, he said, when I foresee the evils they will bring on my posterity. There was reason for these Xerxes' tears. The men who have built a ship and invented the rig, cordage, sail, compass, and pump, the working in and out of port, have acquired much more than a ship. Now arm them, and every shore is at their mercy. 4. If they have not numerical superiority where they anchor, they have only to sail a mile or two to find it. Bonaparte's art of war, namely of concentrating force on the point of attack, must always be theirs who have the choice of the battleground. Of course they come into the fight from a higher ground of power than the land nations, and can engage them on shore with a victorious advantage in the retreat. As soon as the shores are sufficiently peopled to make piracy a losing business, the same skill and courage are ready for the service of trade. The Heimskringla, or Sagas of the Kings of Norway, collected by Snorro Sturluson, is the Iliad and Odyssey of English history. Its portraits, like Homer's, are strongly individualized. The sagas describe a monarchical republic like Sparta. The government disappears before the importance of citizens. In Norway, no Persian masses fight and perish to aggrandize a king, but the actors are bonders or landholders, every one of whom is named and personally and patronymically described, as the king's friend and companion. A sparse population gives this high worth to every man. Individuals are often noticed as very handsome persons, which trait only brings the story nearer to the English race. Then the solid material interest predominates, so dear to English understanding, wherein the association is logical, between merit and land. The heroes of the sagas are not the knights of South Europe. No vaporing of France and Spain has corrupted them. They are substantial farmers, whom the rough times have forced to defend their properties. They have weapons which they use in a determined manner, by no means for chivalry, but for their acres. They are people considerably advanced in rural arts, living 30. Amphibiously on a rough coast, and drawing half their food from the sea, and half from the land. They have herds of cows, and malt, wheat, bacon, butter, and cheese. They fish in the fjord, and hunt the deer. A king among these farmers has a varying power, sometimes not exceeding the authority of a sheriff. A king was maintained much as, in some of our country districts, a winter schoolmaster is quartered, a week here, a week there, and a fortnight on the next farm, on all the farmers in rotation. This the king calls going into guest quarters, and it was the only way in which, in a poor country, a poor king, with many retainers, could be kept alive, when he leaves his own farm to collect his dues through the kingdom. These Norsemen are excellent persons in the main, with good sense, steadiness, wise speech, and prompt action. But they have a singular turn for homicide. Their chief end of man is to murder, or to be murdered. Oars, scythes, harpoons, crowbars, peat knives, and hay-forks, are tools valued by them all the more for their charming aptitude for assassinations. A pair of kings, after dinner, will divert themselves by thrusting each his sword through the other's body, as did in Van Alph. Another pair ride out on a morning for a frolic, and, finding no weapon near, will take the bits out of their horses' mouths, and crush each other's heads with them, as did Alric and Eric. The sight of a tent cord or a cloak string puts them on hanging somebody, a wife, or a husband, or, best of all, a king. If a farmer has so much as a hay-fork, he sticks it into a king dag. King Ingiald finds it vastly amusing to burn up half a dozen kings in a hall, after getting them drunk. Never was poor gentleman so surfeited with life, so furious to be rid of it, as the Northman. If he cannot pick any other quarrel, he will get himself comfortably gored by a bull's horns, like Egil, or slain by a landslide, like the agricultural king Onund. Odin died in his bed, in Sweden, but it was a proverb of ill condition, to die the death of old age. King Haak of Sweden cuts and slashes in battle, as long as he can stand, then orders his warship, loaded with his dead men and their weapons, to be taken out to sea, the tiller shipped, and the sails spread. Being left alone, he sets fire to some tar wood, and lies down contented on deck. The wind blew off the land, the ship flew burning in clear flame, out between the islets into the ocean, and there was the right end of King Haak. 31. The early sagas are sanguinary and piratical, the later are of a noble strain. History rarely yields us better passages than the conversation between King Sigurd the Crusader, and King Eystein, his brother, on their respective merits, one, the soldier, and the other, a lover of the arts of peace. But the reader of the Norman history must steel himself by holding fast the remote compensations which result from animal vigor. As the old fossil world shows that the first steps of reducing the chaos were confided to saurians and other huge and horrible animals, so the foundations of the new civility were to be laid by the most savage men. The Normans came out of France into England worse men than they went into it, 160 years before. They had lost their own language, and learned the Romance or barbarous Latin of the Gauls, and had acquired, with the language, all the vices it had names for. The conquest has obtained in the chronicles, the name of the memory of sorrow. 20,000 thieves landed at Hastings. These founders of the House of Lords were greedy and ferocious dragoons, sons of greedy and ferocious pirates. They were all alike, they took everything they could carry, they burned, harried, violated, tortured, and killed, until everything English was brought to the verge of ruin. Such, however, is the illusion of antiquity and wealth, that decent and dignified men now existing boast their descent from these filthy thieves, who showed a far juster conviction of their own merits, by assuming for their types the swine, goat, jackal, leopard, wolf, and snake, which they severally resembled. England yielded to the Danes and Northmen in the 10th and 11th centuries, and was the receptacle into which all the metal of that strenuous population was poured. The continued draft of the best men in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, to these piratical expeditions, exhausted those countries, like a tree which bears much fruit when young, and these have been second-rate powers ever since. The power of the race migrated, and left Norway void. King Olaf said, when King Harald, my father, went westward to England, the chosen men in Norway followed him, but Norway was so emptied then, that such men have not since been to find in the country, nor especially such a leader as King Harald was for wisdom and bravery. 32. It was a tardy recoil of these invasions, when, in 1801, the British government sent Nelson to bombard the Danish forts in the Sound, and, in 1807, Lord Cathcart, at Copenhagen, took the entire Danish fleet, as it lay in the basins, and all the equipments from the arsenal, and carried them to England. Konghelle, the town where the kings of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were wont to meet, is now rented to a private English gentleman for a hunting ground. It took many generations to trim, and comb, and perfume the first boatload of Norse pirates into royal highnesses and most noble knights of the Garter, but every sparkle of ornament dates back to the Norse boat. There will be time enough to mellow this strength into civility and religion. It is a medical fact, that the children of the blind see, the children of felons have a healthy conscience. Many a mean, dastardly boy is, at the age of puberty, transformed into a serious and generous youth. The mildness of the following ages has not quite effaced these traits of Odin, as the rudiment of a structure matured in the tiger is said to be still found unabsorbed in the Caucasian man. The nation has a tough, acrid, animal nature, which centuries of churching and civilizing have not been able to sweeten. Alfieri said, the crimes of Italy were the proof of the superiority of the stock, and one may say of England, that this watch moves on a splinter of adamant. The English uncultured are a brutal nation. The crimes recorded in their calendars leave nothing to be desired in the way of cold malignity. Dear to the English heart is a fair stand-up fight. The brutality of the manners in the lower class appears in the boxing, bear-baiting, cock-fighting, love of executions, and in the readiness for a set-to in the streets, delightful to the English of all classes. The costermongers of London streets hold cowardice in loathing. We must work our fists well, we are all handy with our fists. The public schools are charged with being bear gardens of brutal strength, and are liked by the people for that cause. The fagging is a trait of the same quality. Medwin, in the Life of Shelley, relates, that, at a military school, they rolled up a young man in a snowball, and left him so in his room, while the other cadets went to church, and crippled him for life. They have retained impressment, deck flogging, army flogging, and school flogging. Such is the ferocity of the army discipline, that a soldier sentenced to flogging, sometimes prays that his sentence may be commuted to death. Flogging banished from the armies of Western 33. Europe, remains here by the sanction of the Duke of Wellington. The right of the husband to sell the wife has been retained down to our times. The Jews have been the favorite victims of royal and popular persecution. Henry III mortgaged all the Jews in the kingdom to his brother, the Earl of Cornwall, as security for money which he borrowed. The torture of criminals, and the rack for extorting evidence, were slowly disused. Of the criminal statutes, Sir Samuel Romilly said, I have examined the codes of all nations, and ours is the worst, and worthy of the anthropophagi. In the last session, the House of Commons was listening to details of flogging and torture practiced in the jails. As soon as this land, thus geographically posted, got a hardy people into it, they could not help becoming the sailors and factors of the globe. From childhood, they dabbled in water, they swum like fishes, their playthings were boats. In the case of the ship money, the judges delivered it for law, that England being an island, the very Midland shires therein are all to be accounted maritime, and Fuller adds, the genius even of landlocked counties driving the natives with a maritime dexterity. As early as the Conquest, it is remarked in explanation of the wealth of England, that its merchants trade to all countries. The English, at the present day, have great vigor of body and endurance. Other countrymen look slight and undersized beside them, and invalids. They are bigger men than the Americans. I suppose 100 English taken at random out of the street, would weigh a fourth more, than so many Americans. Yet, I am told, the skeleton is not larger. They are round, ruddy, and handsome, at least, the whole bust is well formed, and there is a tendency to stout and powerful frames. I remarked the stoutness, on my first landing at Liverpool, porter, drayman, coachman, guard, what substantial, respectable, grandfatherly figures, with costume and manners to suit. The American has arrived at the old mansion house, and finds himself among uncles, aunts, and grandsires. The pictures on the chimney tiles of his nursery were pictures of these people. Here they are in the identical costumes and air, which so took him. It is the fault of their forms that they grow stocky, and the women have that disadvantage, few tall, slender figures of flowing shape, but stunted and thick-set persons. The French say, that the English women 34. Have 2 left hands. But, in all ages, they are a handsome race. The bronze monuments of crusaders lying cross-legged, in the Temple Church at London, and those in Worcester and in Salisbury cathedrals, which are 700 years old, are of the same type as the best youthful heads of men now in England, pleased by beauty of the same character, an expression blending good nature, valour, and refinement, and, mainly, by that uncorrupt youth in the face of manhood, which is daily seen in the streets of London. Both branches of the Scandinavian race are distinguished for beauty. The anecdote of the handsome captives which Saint Gregory found at Rome, AD 600, is matched by the testimony of the Norman chroniclers, 5 centuries later, who wondered at the beauty and long flowing hair of the young English captives. Meantime, the Heimskringla has frequent occasion to speak of the personal beauty of its heroes. When it is considered what humanity, what resources of mental and moral power, the traits of the blonde race betoken, its accession to empire marks a new and finer epoch, wherein the old mineral force shall be subjugated at last by humanity, and shall plough in its furrow henceforward. It is not a final race, once a crab always crab, but a race with a future. On the English face are combined decision and nerve, with the fair complexion, blue eyes, and open and florid aspect. Hence the love of truth, hence the sensibility, the fine perception, and poetic construction. The fair Saxon man, with open front, and honest meaning, domestic, affectionate, is not the wood out of which cannibal, or inquisitor, or assassin is made, but he is moulded for law, lawful trade, civility, marriage, the nurture of children, for colleges, churches, charities, and colonies. They are rather manly than warlike. When the war is over, the mask falls from the affectionate and domestic tastes, which make them women in kindness. This union of qualities is fabled in their national legend of Beauty and the Beast, or, long before, in the Greek legend of Hermaphrodite. The two sexes are so present in the English mind. I apply to Britannia, Queen of Seas and Colonies, the words in which her latest novelist portrays his heroine: she is as mild as she is game, and as game as she is mild. The English delight in the antagonism which combines in one person the extremes of courage and tenderness. Nelson, 35, dying at Trafalgar, sends his love to Lord Collingwood, and, like an innocent schoolboy that goes to bed, says, "Kiss me, hearty," and turns to sleep. Lord Collingwood, his comrade, was of a nature the most affectionate and domestic. Admiral Rodney's figure approached to delicacy and effeminacy, and he declared himself very sensible to fear, which he surmounted only by considerations of honour and public duty. Clarendon says, the Duke of Buckingham was so modest and gentle, that some courtiers attempted to put affronts on him, until they found that this modesty and effeminacy was only a mask for the most terrible determination. And Sir James Parry said, the other day, of Sir John Franklin, that, if he found Wellington Sound open, he explored it, for he was a man who never turned his back on a danger, yet of that tenderness, that he would not brush away a mosquito. Even for their highwaymen the same virtue is claimed, and Robin Hood comes described to us as Midasimus Praetonum, the gentlest thief. But they know where their war dogs lie. Cromwell, Blake, Marlborough, Chatham, Nelson, and Wellington, are not to be trifled with, and the brutal strength which lies at the bottom of society, the animal ferocity of the quays and cockpits, the bullies of the costermongers of Shoreditch, Seven Dials, and Spitalfields, they know how to wake up. They have a vigorous health, and last well into middle and old age. The old men are as red as roses, and still handsome. A clear skin, a peach bloom complexion, and good teeth, are found all over the island. They use a plentiful and nutritious diet. The operative cannot subsist on watercresses. Beef, mutton, wheat bread, and malt liquors, are universal among the first-class labourers. Good feeding is a chief point of national pride among the vulgar, and, in their caricatures, they represent the Frenchman as a poor, starved body. It is curious that Tacitus found the English beer already in use among the Germans. They make from barley or wheat a drink corrupted into some resemblance to wine. Lord Chief Justice Fortescue in Henry VI's time, says, the inhabitants of England drink no water, unless at certain times, on a religious score, and by way of penance. The extremes of poverty and ascetic penance, it would seem, never reach cold water in England. Wood, the antiquary, in describing the poverty and maceration of Father Lacy, an English Jesuit, does not deny him beer. He says, his bed was under a thatching. 36. And the way to it up a ladder, his fare was coarse, his drink, of a penny a gone, or gallon. They have more constitutional energy than any other people. They think, with Henri Cotter, that manly exercises are the foundation of that elevation of mind which gives one nature ascendant over another, or, with the Arabs, that the days spent in the chase are not counted in the length of life. They box, run, shoot, ride, row, and sail from pole to pole. They eat, and drink, and live jolly in the open air, putting a bar of solid sleep between day and day. They walk and ride as fast as they can, their head bent forward, as if urged on some pressing affair. The French say, that Englishmen in the street always walk straight before them like mad dogs. Men and women walk with infatuation. As soon as he can handle a gun, hunting is the fine art of every Englishman of condition. They are the most voracious people of prey that ever existed. Every season turns out the aristocracy into the country, to shoot and fish. The more vigorous run out of the island to Europe, to America, to Asia, to Africa, and Australia, to hunt with fury by gun, by trap, by harpoon, by lasso, with dog, with horse, with elephant, or with dromedary, all the game that is in nature. These men have written the game books of all countries, as Hawker, Scrope, Murray, Herbert, Maxwell, Cumming, and a host of travellers. The people at home are addicted to boxing, running, leaping, and rowing matches. I suppose, the dogs and horses must be thanked for the fact, that the men have muscles almost as tough and supple as their own. If in every efficient man, there is first a fine animal, in the English race it is of the best breed, a wealthy, juicy, broad-chested creature, steeped in ale and good cheer, and a little overloaded by his flesh. Men of animal nature rely, like animals, on their instincts. The Englishman associates well with dogs and horses. His attachment to the horse arises from the courage and address required to manage it. The horse finds out who is afraid of it, and does not disguise its opinion. Their young boiling clerks and lusty collegians like the company of horses better than the company of professors. I suppose, the horses are better company for them. The horse has more uses than Buffon noted. If you go into the streets, every driver in bus or dray is a bully, and, if I wanted a good troop of soldiers, I should recruit among the stables. Add a certain degree of refinement to 37. The vivacity of these riders, and you obtain the precise quality which makes the men and women of polite society formidable. They come honestly by their horsemanship, with hengst and horse afore their Saxon founders. The other branch of their race had been Tartar nomads. The horse was all their wealth. The children were fed on mare's milk. The pastures of Tartary were still remembered by the tenacious practice of the Norsemen to eat horse flesh at religious feasts. In the Danish invasions, the marauders seized upon horses where they landed, and were at once converted into a body of expert cavalry. At one time, this skill seems to have declined. 2 centuries ago, the English horse never performed any eminent service beyond the seas, and the reason assigned, was, that the genius of the English hath always more inclined them to foot service, as pure and proper manhood, without any mixture, whilst, in a victory on horseback, the credit ought to be divided betwixt the man and his horse. But in 200 years, a change has taken place. Now, they boast that they understand horses better than any other people in the world, and that their horses are become their second selves. William the Conqueror being, says Camden, better affected to beasts than to men, imposed heavy fines and punishments on those that should meddle with his game. The Saxon Chronicle says, he loved the tall deer as if he were their father. And rich Englishmen have followed his example, according to their ability, ever since, in encroaching on the tillage and commons with their game preserves. It is a proverb in England, that it is safer to shoot a man, than a hare. The severity of the game law certainly indicates an extravagant sympathy of the nation with horses and hunters. The gentlemen are always on horseback, and have brought horses to an ideal perfection. The English racer is a factitious breed. A score or two of mounted gentlemen may frequently be seen running like centaurs down a hill nearly as steep as the roof of a house. Every inn-room is lined with pictures of races, telegraphs communicate, every hour, tidings of the heats from Newmarket and Ascot, and the House of Commons adjourns over the Derby Day. 38. Chapter 5. Ability. The Saxon and the Northman are both Scandinavians. History does not allow us to fix the limits of the application of these names with any accuracy, but from the residence of a portion of these people in France, and from some effect of that powerful soil on their blood and manners, the Norman has come popularly to represent in England the aristocratic, and the Saxon the democratic principle. And though, I doubt not, the nobles are of both tribes, and the workers of both, yet we are forced to use the names a little mythically, one to represent the worker, and the other the enjoyer. The island was a prize for the best race. Each of the dominant races tried its fortune in turn. The Phoenician, the Celt, and the Goth, had already got in. The Roman came, but in the very day when his fortune culminated. He looked in the eyes of a new people that was to supplant his own. He disembarked his legions, erected his camps and towers. Presently he heard bad news from Italy, and worse, every year. At last, he made a handsome compliment of roads and walls, and departed. But the Saxon seriously settled in the land, builded, tilled, fished, and traded, with German truth and adhesiveness. The Dane came, and divided with him. Last of all, the Norman, or French Dane, arrived, and formally conquered, harried, and ruled the kingdom. A century later, it came out, that the Saxon had the most bottom and longevity, had managed to make the victor speak the language and accept the law and usage of the victim, forced the baron to dictate Saxon terms to Norman kings, and, step by step, got all the essential securities of civil liberty invented and confirmed. The genius of the race and the genius of the place conspired to this effect. The island is lucrative to free labor, but not worth possession on other terms. The race was so intellectual, that a feudal or military tenure could not last longer than the war. The power of the Saxon Danes, so thoroughly beaten in the war, that the name of English and villain were synonymous, yet so vivacious as to extort charters from the kings, stood on the strong personality of these people. Sense and economy must rule in a world which is made of sense and economy, and the banker, with his 7%, drives the 39 Earl out of his castle. A nobility of soldiers cannot keep down a commonalty of shrewd scientific persons. What signifies a pedigree of 100 links, against a cotton spinner with steam in his mill, or, against a company of broad-shouldered Liverpool merchants, for whom Stevenson and Brunel are contriving locomotives and a tubular bridge? These Saxons are the hands of mankind. They have the taste for toil, a distaste for pleasure or repose, and the telescopic appreciation of distant gain. They are the wealth makers, and by dint of mental faculty, which has its own conditions. The Saxon works after liking, or, only for himself, and to set him at work, and to begin to draw his monstrous values out of barren Britain, all dishonour, fret, and barrier must be removed, and then his energies begin to play. The Scandinavian fancied himself surrounded by trolls, a kind of goblin men, with vast power of work and skillful production, divine stevedores, carpenters, reapers, smiths, and masons, swift to reward every kindness done them, with gifts of gold and silver. In all English history, this dream comes to pass. Certain trolls or working brains, under the names of Alfred, Bede, Caxton, Bracton, Camden, Drake, Selden, Dugdale, Newton, Gibbon, Brindley, Watt, Wedgwood, dwell in the troll mounts of Britain, and turn the sweat of their face to power and renown. If the race is good, so is the place. Nobody landed on this spellbound island with impunity. The enchantments of barren shingle and rough weather, transformed every adventurer into a labourer. Each vagabond that arrived bent his neck to the yoke of gain, or found the air too tense for him. The strong survived, the weaker went to the ground. Even the pleasure hunters and sots of England are of a tougher texture. A hard temperament had been formed by Saxon and Saxon Dane, and such of these French or Normans as could reach it, were naturalized in every sense. All the admirable expedients or means hit upon in England must be looked at as growths or irresistible offshoots of the expanding mind of the race. A man of that brain thinks and acts thus, and his neighbour, being afflicted with the same kind of brain, though he is rich, and called a baron, or a duke, thinks the same thing, and is ready to allow the 40. Justice of the thought and act in his retainer or tenant, though sorely against his baronial or ducal will. The island was renowned in antiquity for its breed of mastiffs, so fierce, that, when their teeth were set, you must cut their heads off to part them. The man was like his dog. The people have that nervous bilious temperament, which is known by medical men to resist every means employed to make its possessor subservient to the will of others. The English game is main force to main force, the planting of foot to foot, fair play and open field, a rough tug without trick or dodging, till one or both come to pieces. King Ethelwald spoke the language of his race, when he planted himself at Wimborne, and said, he would do one of two things, or there live, or there lie. They hate craft and subtlety. They neither poison, nor waylay, nor assassinate, and, when they have pounded each other to a poultice, they will shake hands and be friends for the remainder of their lives. You shall trace these Gothic touches at school, at country fairs, at the hustings, and in Parliament. No artifice, no breach of truth and plain dealing, not so much as secret ballot, is suffered in the island. In Parliament, the tactics of the opposition is to resist every step of the government, by a pitiless attack, and in a bargain, no prospect of advantage is so dear to the merchant, as the thought of being tricked is mortifying. Sir Kenelm Digby, a courtier of Charles and James, who won the sea fight of Scanderoon, was a model Englishman in his day. His person was handsome and gigantic, he had so graceful elocution and noble address, that, had he been dropped out of the clouds in any part of the world, he would have made himself respected. He was skilled in 6 tongues, and master of arts and arms. 3 Sir Kenelm wrote a book, of bodies and of souls, in which he propounds, that syllogisms do breed or rather are all the variety of man's life. They are the steps by which we walk in all our businesses. Man, as he is man, doth nothing else but weave such chains. Whatsoever he doth, swerving from this work, he doth as deficient from the nature of man, and, if he do aught beyond this, by breaking out into divers sorts of exterior actions, he findeth. 3 Anthony Wood. 41. Nevertheless, in this linked sequel of simple discourses, the art, the cause, the rule, the bounds, and the model of it. 4. There spoke the genius of the English people. There is a necessity on them to be logical. They would hardly greet the good that did not logically fall, as if it excluded their own merit, or shook their understandings. They are jealous of minds that have much facility of association, from an instinctive fear that the seeing many relations to their thought might impair this serial continuity and lucrative concentration. They are impatient of genius, or of minds addicted to contemplation, and cannot conceal their contempt for sallies of thought, however lawful, whose steps they cannot count by their wonted rule. Neither do they reckon better a syllogism that ends in syllogism. For they have a supreme eye to facts, and theirs is a logic that brings salt to soup, hammer to nail, or to boat, the logic of cooks, carpenters, and chemists, following the sequence of nature, and one on which words make no impression. Their mind is not dazzled by its own means, but locked and bolted to results. They love men, who, like Samuel Johnson, a doctor in the schools, would jump out of his syllogism the instant his major proposition was in danger, to save that, at all hazards. Their practical vision is spacious, and they can hold many threads without entangling them. All the steps they orderly take, but with the high logic of never confounding the minor and major proposition, keeping their eye on their aim, in all the complicity and delay incident to the several series of means they employ. There is room in their minds for this and that, a science of degrees. In the courts, the independence of the judges and the loyalty of the suitors are equally excellent. In Parliament, they have hit on that capital invention of freedom, a constitutional opposition. And when courts and Parliament are both deaf, the plaintiff is not silenced. Calm, patient, his weapon of defense from year to year is the obstinate reproduction of the grievance with calculations and estimates. But, meantime, he is drawing numbers and money to his opinion, resolved that if all remedy fails, right of revolution is at the bottom of his charter box. They are bound to see their measure carried, and stick to it through ages of defeat. For man's soul, p. 29. 42. Into this English logic, however, an infusion of justice enters, not so apparent in other races, a belief in the existence of two sides, and the resolution to see fair play. There is on every question, an appeal from the assertion of the parties, to the proof of what is asserted. They are impious in their skepticism of a theory, but kiss the dust before a fact. Is it a machine? Is it a charter? Is it a boxer in the ring? Is it a candidate on the hustings? The universe of Englishmen will suspend their judgment, until the trial can be had. They are not to be led by a phrase, they want a working plan, a working machine, a working constitution, and will sit out the trial, and abide by the issue, and reject all preconceived theories. In politics they put blunt questions, which must be answered. Who is to pay the taxes? What will you do for trade? What for corn? What for the spinner? This singular fairness and its results strike the French with surprise. Philip de Comines says, "Now, in my opinion, among all the sovereignties I know in the world, that in which the public good is best attended to, and the least violence exercised on the people, is that of England. Life is safe, and personal rights, and what is freedom, without security? Whilst, in France, fraternity, equality, and indivisible unity, are names for assassination." Montesquieu said, "England is the freest country in the world. If a man in England had as many enemies as hairs on his head, no harm would happen to him." Their self-respect, their faith in causation, and their realistic logic or coupling of means to ends, have given them the leadership of the modern world. Montesquieu said, "No people have true common sense but those who are born in England." This common sense is a perception of all the conditions of our earthly existence, of laws that can be stated, and of laws that cannot be stated, or that are learned only by practice, in which allowance for friction is made. They are impious in their skepticism of theory, and in high departments they are cramped and sterile. But the unconditional surrender to facts, and the choice of means to reach their ends, are as admirable as with ants and bees. The bias of the nation is a passion for utility. They love the lever, the screw and pulley, the Flanders draft horse, the waterfall, windmills, tide mills, the sea and the wind to bear their freight ships. More than the diamond Koh-i-Noor, which glitters among their crown jewels, they prize. 43. That dull pebble which is wiser than a man, whose poles turn themselves to the poles of the world, and whose axis is parallel to the axis of the world. Now, their toys are steam and galvanism. They are heavy at the fine arts, but adroit at the coarse, not good in jewelry or mosaics, but the best iron masters, colliers, wool combers, and tanners, in Europe. They apply themselves to agriculture, to draining, to resisting encroachments of sea, wind, travelling sands, cold and wet subsoil, to fishery, to manufacture of indispensable staples, salt, plumbago, leather, wool, glass, pottery, and brick, to bees and silkworms, and by their steady combinations they succeed. A manufacturer sits down to dinner in a suit of clothes which was wool on a sheep's back at sunrise. You dine with a gentleman on venison, pheasant, quail, pigeons, poultry, mushrooms, and pineapples, all the growth of his estate. They are neat husbands for ordering all their tools pertaining to house and field. All are well kept. There is no want and no waste. They study use and fitness in their building, in the order of their dwellings, and in their dress. The Frenchman invented the ruffle, the Englishman added the shirt. The Englishman wears a sensible coat buttoned to the chin, of rough but solid and lasting texture. If he is a lord, he dresses a little worse than a commoner. They have diffused the taste for plain substantial hats, shoes, and coats through Europe. They think him the best dressed man, whose dress is so fit for his use that you cannot notice or remember to describe it. They secure the essentials in their diet, in their arts, and manufactures. Every article of cutlery shows, in its shape, thought and long experience of workmen. They put the expense in the right place, as, in their sea steamers, in the solidity of the machinery and the strength of the boat. The admirable equipment of their Arctic ships carries London to the pole. They build roads, aqueducts, warm and ventilate houses. And they have impressed their directness and practical habit on modern civilization. In trade, the Englishman believes that nobody breaks who ought not to break, and that, if he do not make trade everything, it will make him nothing, and acts on this belief. The spirit of system, attention to details, and the subordination of details, or, the not driving things too finely, which is charged on the Germans, constitute that dispatch of business, which makes the mercantile power of England. 44. In war, the Englishman looks to his means. He is of the opinion of Civilis, his German ancestor, whom Tacitus reports as holding that the gods are on the side of the strongest, a sentence which Bonaparte unconsciously translated, when he said, that he had noticed, that Providence always favored the heaviest battalion. Their military science propounds that if the weight of the advancing column is greater than that of the resisting, the latter is destroyed. Therefore Wellington, when he came to the army in Spain, had every man weighed, first with accoutrements, and then without, believing that the force of an army depended on the weight and power of the individual soldiers, in spite of cannon. Lord Palmerston told the House of Commons, that more care is taken of the health and comfort of English troops than of any other troops in the world, and that, hence the English can put more men into the rank, on the day of action, on the field of battle, than any other army. Before the bombardment of the Danish forts in the Baltic, Nelson spent day after day, himself in the boats, on the exhausting service of sounding the channel. Clerk of Eldon's celebrated maneuver of breaking the line of sea battle, and Nelson's feat of doubling, or stationing his ships one on the outer bow, and another on the outer quarter of each of the enemies were only translations into naval tactics of Bonaparte's rule of concentration. Lord Collingwood was accustomed to tell his men, that, if they could fire 3 well-directed broadsides in 5 minutes, no vessel could resist them, and, from constant practice, they came to do it in 3 minutes and a half. But conscious that no race of better men exists, they rely most on the simplest means, and do not like ponderous and difficult tactics, but delight to bring the affair hand to hand, where the victory lies with the strength, courage, and endurance of the individual combatants. They adopt every improvement in rig, in motor, in weapons, but they fundamentally believe that the best stratagem in naval war, is to lay your ship close alongside of the enemy's ship, and bring all your guns to bear on him, until you or he go to the bottom. This is the old fashion, which never goes out of fashion, neither in nor out of England. It is not usually a point of honour, nor a religious sentiment, and never any whim that they will shed their blood for, but usually property, and right measured by property, that breeds revolution. They have no Indian taste for a tomahawk dance, no French taste for a badge or a 45. Proclamation. The Englishman is peaceably minding his business, and earning his day's wages. But if you offer to lay hand on his day's wages, on his cow, or his right in common, or his shop, he will fight to the judgment. Magna Carta, jury trial, habeas corpus, Star Chamber, ship money, popery, Plymouth Colony, American Revolution, are all questions involving a yeoman's right to his dinner, and, except as touching that, would not have lashed the British nation to rage and revolt. Whilst they are thus instinct with a spirit of order, and of calculation, it must be owned they are capable of larger views, but the indulgence is expensive to them, costs great crises, or accumulations of mental power. In common, the horse works best with blinders. Nothing is more in the line of English thought, than our unvarnished Connecticut question, "Pray, sir, how do you get your living when you are at home?" The questions of freedom, of taxation, of privilege, are money questions. Heavy fellows, steeped in beer and flesh pots, they are hard of hearing and dim of sight. Their drowsy minds need to be flagellated by war and trade and politics and persecution. They cannot well read a principle, except by the light of faggots and of burning towns. Tacitus says of the Germans, powerful only in sudden efforts, they are impatient of toil and labor. This highly destined race, if it had not somewhere added the chamber of patience to its brain, would not have built London. I know not from which of the tribes and temperaments that went to the composition of the people this tenacity was supplied, but they clinch every nail they drive. They have no running for luck, and no immoderate speed. They spend largely on their fabric, and await the slow return. Their leather lies tanning 7 years in the vat. At Rogers's Mills, in Sheffield, where I was shown the process of making a razor and a penknife, I was told there is no luck in making good steel, that they make no mistakes, every blade in the 100 and in the 1,000 is good. And that is characteristic of all their work, no more is attempted than is done. When Thor and his companions arrive at Utgard, he is told that nobody is permitted to remain here, unless he understands some art, and excel in it all other men. The same question is still put to the posterity of Thor. A nation of laborers, every man is trained to some one art or detail, and 46. Aims at perfection in that, not content unless he has something in which he thinks he surpasses all other men. He would rather not do anything at all, than not do it well. I suppose no people have such thoroughness, from the highest to the lowest, every man meaning to be master of his art. To show capacity, a Frenchman described as the end of a speech in debate, "No," said an Englishman, "but to set your shoulder at the wheel, to advance the business." Sir Samuel Romilly refused to speak in popular assemblies, confining himself to the House of Commons, where a measure can be carried by a speech. The business of the House of Commons is conducted by a few persons, but these are hard-worked. Sir Robert Peel knew the Blue Books by heart. His colleagues and rivals carry Hansard in their heads. The high civil and legal offices are not beds of ease, but posts which exact frightful amounts of mental labor. Many of the great leaders, like Pitt, Canning, Castlereagh, Romilly, are soon worked to death. They are excellent judges England of a good worker, and when they find one, like Clarendon, Sir Philip Warwick, Sir William Coventry, Ashley, Burke, Thurlow, Mansfield, Pitt, Eldon, Peel, or Russell, there is nothing too good or too high for him. They have a wonderful heat in the pursuit of a public aim private persons exhibit, in scientific and antiquarian researches, the same pertinacity as the nation showed in the coalitions in which it yoked Europe against the empire of Bonaparte, one after the other defeated, and still renewed, until the 6th hurled him from his seat. Sir John Herschel, in completion of the work of his father, who had made the catalogue of the stars of the northern hemisphere, expatriated himself for years at the Cape of Good Hope, finished his inventory of the southern heaven, came home and redacted it in 8 years more, a work whose value does not begin until 30 years have elapsed, and thenceforward a record to all ages of the highest import. The Admiralty sent out the Arctic expeditions year after year, in search of Sir John Franklin, until, at last, they have threaded their way through polar pack and Bering's Straits, and solved the geographical problem. Lord Elgin, at Athens, saw the imminent ruin of the Greek remains, set up his scaffoldings, in spite of epigrams, and, after 5 years' labor to collect them, got his marbles on shipboard. The ship struck a rock, and went to 47. The bottom. He had them all fished up, by divers, at a vast expense, and brought to London, not knowing that Haydon, Fuseli, and Canova, and all good heads in all the world, were to be his applauders. In the same spirit, were the excavation and research by Sir Charles Fellows, for the Xanthian monument, and of Layard, for his Nineveh sculptures. The nation sits in the immense city they have builded, a London extended into every man's mind, though he live in Van Diemen's Land or Cape Town. Faithful performance of what is undertaken to be performed, they honor in themselves, and exact in others, as certificate of equality with themselves. The modern world is theirs. They have made and make it day by day. The commercial relations of the world are so intimately drawn to London, that every dollar on earth contributes to the strength of the English government. And if all the wealth in the planet should perish by war or deluge, they know themselves competent to replace it. They have approved their Saxon blood, by their seagoing qualities, their descent from Odin's smiths, by their hereditary skill in working in iron, their British birth, by husbandry and immense wheat harvests, and justified their occupancy of the centre of habitable land, by their supreme ability and cosmopolitan spirit. They have tilled, builded, forged, spun, and woven. They have made the island a thoroughfare, and London a shop, a law court, a record office, and scientific bureau, inviting to strangers, a sanctuary to refugees of every political and religious opinion, and such a city, that almost every active man, in any nation, finds himself, at one time or other, forced to visit it. In every path of practical activity, they have gone even with the best. There is no secret of war, in which they have not shown mastery. The steam chamber of Watt, the locomotive of Stephenson, the cotton mule of Roberts, perform the labor of the world. There is no department of literature, of science, or of useful art, in which they have not produced a first-rate book. It is England, whose opinion is waited for on the merit of a new invention, an improved science. And in the complications of the trade and politics of their vast empire, they have been equal to every exigency, with counsel and with conduct. Is it their luck, or is it in the chambers of their brain? It is their commercial advantage, that whatever light appears in better method or happy invention, breaks out in their race. They are a family to which a destiny attaches, and they. 48. Banshee has sworn that a male heir shall never be wanting. They have a wealth of men to fill important posts, and the vigilance of party criticism ensures the selection of a competent person. A proof of the energy of the British people, is the highly artificial construction of the whole fabric. The climate and geography, I said, were factitious, as if the hands of man had arranged the conditions. The same character pervades the whole kingdom. Bacon said, Rome was a state not subject to paradoxes, but England subsists by antagonisms and contradictions. The foundations of its greatness are the rolling waves, and, from first to last, it is a museum of anomalies. This foggy and rainy country furnishes the world with astronomical observations. Its short rivers do not afford water power, but the land shakes under the thunder of the mills. There is no gold mine of any importance, but there is more gold in England than in all other countries. It is too far north for the culture of the vine, but the wines of all countries are in its docks. The French Comte de Lauragouise said, no fruit ripens in England but a baked apple, but oranges and pineapples are as cheap in London as in the Mediterranean. The Mark Lane Express, or the Custom House returns bear out to the letter the vaunt of Pope. Let India boast her palms, nor envy we the weeping amber, nor the spicy tree. While, by our oaks, those precious loads are borne, and realms commanded which those trees adorn. The native cattle are extinct, but the island is full of artificial breeds. The agriculturist Bakewell created sheep and cows and horses to order, and breeds in which everything was omitted but what is economical. The cow is sacrificed to her bag, the ox to his sirloin. Stall feeding makes sperm mills of the cattle, and converts the stable to a chemical factory. The rivers, lakes, and ponds, too much fished, or obstructed by factories, are artificially filled with the eggs of salmon, turbot, and herring. Chat moss and the fens of Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire are unhealthy and too barren to pay rent. By cylindrical tiles, and gutta percha tubes, 5 millions of acres of bad land have been drained and put on equality with the best, for rape culture and grass. The climate too, which was already believed to have become milder and drier by the enormous consumption of coal, is so far reached by this new action, that 49. Fogs and storms are said to disappear. In due course, all England will be drained, and rise a second time out of the waters. The latest step was to call in the aid of steam to agriculture. Steam is almost an Englishman. I do not know, but they will send him to Parliament, next, to make laws. He weaves, forges, saws, pounds, fans, and now he must pump, grind, dig, and plough for the farmer. The markets created by the manufacturing population have erected agriculture into a great thriving and spending industry. The value of the houses in Britain is equal to the value of the soil. Artificial aids of all kinds are cheaper than the natural resources. No man can afford to walk, when the parliamentary train carries him for a penny a mile. Gas burners are cheaper than daylight in numberless floors in the cities. All the houses in London buy their water. The English trade does not exist for the exportation of native products, but on its manufactures, or the making well everything which is ill made elsewhere. They make ponchos for the Mexican, bandanas for the Hindu, ginseng for the Chinese, beads for the Indian, laces for the Flemings, telescopes for astronomers, cannons for kings. The Board of Trade caused the best models of Greece and Italy to be placed within the reach of every manufacturing population. They caused to be translated from foreign languages and illustrated by elaborate drawings, the most approved works of Munich, Berlin, and Paris. They have ransacked Italy to find new forms, to add a grace to the products of their looms, their potteries, and their foundries. 5. The nearer we look, the more artificial is their social system. Their law is a network of fictions. Their property, a scrip, or certificate of right to interest on money that no man ever saw. Their social classes are made by statute. Their ratios of power and representation are historical and legal. The last Reform Bill took away political power from a mound, a ruin, and a stone wall, whilst Birmingham and Manchester, whose mills paid for the wars of Europe, had no representative. Purity in the elective parliament is secured by the purchase of seats. 6 Foreign power is kept by armed colonies, power at home, by a standing army of police. The pauper lives better than the free labourer, the thief better than the pauper, and the transported felon better than the one under imprisonment. They. 5 See Memorial of H. Greenough, p. 66, New York, 1853. 6 Sir S. Romilly, purest of English patriots, decided that the only independent mode of entering Parliament was to buy a seat, and he bought Horsham. 50. Crimes are factitious, as smuggling, poaching, nonconformity, heresy and treason. Better, they say in England, kill a man than a hare. The sovereignty of the seas is maintained by the impressment of seamen. The impressment of seamen, said Lord Eldon, is the life of our navy. Solvency is maintained by means of a national debt, on the principle, if you will not lend me the money, how can I pay you? For the administration of justice, Sir Samuel Romilly's expedient for clearing the arrears of business in Chancery, was, the Chancellor's staying away entirely from his court. Their system of education is factitious. The universities galvanize dead languages into a semblance of life. Their church is artificial. The manners and customs of society are artificial, made-up men with made-up manners, and thus the whole is Birminghamized, and we have a nation whose existence is a work of art, a cold, barren, almost Arctic isle, being made the most fruitful, luxurious, and imperial land in the whole earth. Man in England submits to be a product of political economy. On a bleak moor, a mill is built, a banking house is opened, and men come in, as water in a sluice way, and towns and cities rise. Man is made as a Birmingham button. The rapid doubling of the population dates from Watt's steam engine. A landlord, who owns a province, says, the tenantry are unprofitable, let me have sheep. He unroofs the houses, and ships the population to America. The nation is accustomed to the instantaneous creation of wealth. It is the maxim of their economists, that the greater part and value of the wealth now existing in England, has been produced by human hands within the last 12 months. Meantime, 3 or 4 days' rain will reduce hundreds to starving in London. One secret of their power is their mutual good understanding. Not only good minds are born among them, but all the people have good minds. Every nation has yielded some good wit, if, as has chanced to many tribes, only one. But the intellectual organization of the English admits a communicableness of knowledge and ideas among them all. An electric touch by any of their national ideas, melts them into one family, and brings the hordes of power which their individuality is always hiving, into use and play for all. Is it the smallness of the country, or is it the pride and affection of race? They have solidarity or responsibleness and trust in each other. 51. Their minds, like wool, admit of a dye which is more lasting than the cloth. They embrace their cause with more tenacity than their life. Though not military, yet every common subject by the pole is fit to make a soldier of. These private reserved mute family men can adopt a public end with all their heat, and this strength of affection makes the romance of their heroes. The difference of rank does not divide the national heart. The Danish poet Oehlenschläger complains, that who writes in Danish, writes to 200 readers. In Germany, there is one speech for the learned, and another for the masses, to that extent, that, it is said, no sentiment or phrase from the works of any great German writer is ever heard among the lower classes. But in England, the language of the noble is the language of the poor. In Parliament, in pulpits, in theatres, when the speakers rise to thought and passion, the language becomes idiomatic, the people in the street best understand the best words. And their language seems drawn from the Bible, the common law, and the works of Shakespeare, Bacon, Milton, Pope, Young, Cooper, Burns, and Scott. The island has produced 2 or 3 of the greatest men that ever existed, but they were not solitary in their own time. Men quickly embodied what Newton found out, in Greenwich observatories, and practical navigation. The boys know all that Hutton knew of strata, or Dalton of atoms, or Harvey of blood vessels, and these studies, once dangerous, are in fashion. So what is invented or known in agriculture, or in trade, or in war, or in art, or in literature, and antiquities? A great ability, not amassed on a few giants, but poured into the general mind, so that each of them could at a pinch stand in the shoes of the other, and they are more bound in character, than differenced in ability or in rank. The laborer is a possible lord. The lord is a possible basket maker. Every man carries the English system in his brain, knows what is confided to him, and does therein the best he can. The Chancellor carries England on his mace, the midshipman at the point of his dirk, the smith on his hammer, the cook in the bowl of his spoon, the postilion cracks his whip for England, and the sailor times his oars to God save the King. The very felons have their pride in each other's English stanchness. In politics and in war, they hold together as by hooks of steel. The charm in Nelson's history, is, the unselfish greatness, the assurance of being supported to the uttermost by those whom he supports to the uttermost. Whilst they are some ages ahead of the rest of the world in the art of living, whilst in some directions they do not represent the modern spirit. 52. But constituted this vanguard of civility and power they coldly hold, marching in phalanx, lockstep, foot after foot, file after file of heroes, 10,000 deep. 53. Chapter 6. Manners. I find the Englishman to be him of all men who stands firmest in his shoes. They have in themselves what they value in their horses, mettle, and bottom. On the day of my arrival at Liverpool, a gentleman, in describing to me the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, happened to say, "Lord Clarendon has pluck like a cock, and will fight till he dies," and, what I heard first I heard last, and the one thing the English value, is pluck. The cabmen have it, the merchants have it, the bishops have it, the women have it, the journals have it, the Times newspaper, they say, is the pluckiest thing in England, and Sidney Smith had made it a proverb, that little Lord John Russell, the minister, would take the command of the Channel Fleet tomorrow. They require you to dare to be of your own opinion, and they hate the practical cowards who cannot in affairs answer directly yes or no. They dare to displease, nay, they will let you break all the commandments, if you do it natively, and with spirit. You must be somebody, then you may do this or that, as you will. Machinery has been applied to all work, and carried to such perfection, that little is left for the men but to mind the engines and feed the furnaces. But the machines require punctual service, and, as they never tire, they prove too much for their tenders. Mines, forges, mills, breweries, railroads, steam pump, steam plow, drill of regiments, drill of police, rule of court, and shop rule, have operated to give a mechanical regularity to all the habit and action of men. A terrible machine has possessed itself of the ground, the air, the men and women, and hardly even thought is free. The mechanical might and organization requires in the people constitution and answering spirits, and he who goes among them must have some weight of metal. At last, you take your hint from the fury of life you find, and say, one thing is plain, this is no country for faint-hearted people. Don't creep about diffidently, make up your mind, take your own course, and you shall find respect and furtherance. 54. It requires, men say, a good constitution to travel in Spain. I say as much of England, for other cause, simply on account of the vigor and brawn of the people. Nothing but the most serious business could give one any counterweight to these baresarks, though they were only to order eggs and muffins for their breakfast. The Englishman speaks with all his body. His elocution is stomachic, as the American's is labial. The Englishman is very petulant and precise about his accommodation at inns, and on the roads, acquittal about his toast and his chop, and every species of convenience, and loud and pungent in his expressions of impatience at any neglect. His vivacity betrays itself, at all points, in his manners, in his respiration, and the inarticulate noises he makes in clearing the throat, all significant of burly strength. He has stamina, he can take the initiative in emergencies. He has that aplomb, which results from a good adjustment of the moral and physical nature, and the obedience of all the powers to the will, as if the axes of his eyes were united to his backbone, and only moved with the trunk. This vigor appears in the incuriosity, and stony neglect, each of every other. Each man walks, eats, drinks, shaves, dresses, gesticulates, and, in every manner, acts and suffers without reference to the bystanders, in his own fashion, only careful not to interfere with them, or annoy them. Not that he is trained to neglect the eyes of his neighbors, he is really occupied with his own affair, and does not think of them. Every man in this polished country consults only his convenience, as much as a solitary pioneer in Wisconsin. I know not where any personal eccentricity is so freely allowed, and no man gives himself any concern with it. An Englishman walks in a pouring rain, swinging his closed umbrella like a walking stick, wears a wig, or a shawl, or a saddle, or stands on his head, and no remark is made. And as he has been doing this for several generations, it is now in the blood. In short, every one of these Icelanders is an island himself, safe, tranquil, incommunicable. In a company of strangers, you would think him deaf, his eyes never wander from his table and newspaper. He is never betrayed into any curiosity or unbecoming emotion. They have all been trained in one severe school of manners, and never put off the harness. He does not give his hand. He does not let you meet his eye. It is almost an affront to look a man in the face, without being introduced. In mixed or in select companies they do not introduce persons, so that a 55. Presentation is a circumstance as valid as a contract. Introductions are sacraments. He withholds his name. At the hotel, he is hardly willing to whisper it to the clerk at the book office. If he give you his private address on a card, it is like an avowal of friendship, and his bearing, on being introduced, is cold, even though he is seeking your acquaintance, and is studying how he shall serve you. It was an odd proof of this impressive energy, that, in my lectures, I hesitated to read and threw out for its impertinence many a disparaging phrase, which I had been accustomed to spin, about poor, thin, unable mortals. So much had the fine physique and the personal vigor of this robust race worked on my imagination. I happened to arrive in England, at the moment of a commercial crisis. But it was evident, that, let who will fail, England will not. These people have sat here 1,000 years, and here will continue to sit. They will not break up, or arrive at any desperate revolution, like their neighbors, for they have as much energy, as much continence of character as they ever had. The power and possession which surround them are their own creation, and they exert the same commanding industry at this moment. They are positive, methodical, cleanly, and formal, loving routine, and conventional ways, loving truth and religion, to be sure, but inexorable on points of form. All the world praises the comfort and private appointments of an English inn, and of English households. You are sure of neatness and of personal decorum. A Frenchman may possibly be clean, an Englishman is conscientiously clean. A certain order and complete propriety is found in his dress and in his belongings. Born in a harsh and wet climate, which keeps him indoors whenever he is at rest, and being of an affectionate and loyal temper, he dearly loves his house. If he is rich, he buys a domain, and builds a hall. If he is in middle condition, he spares no expense on his house. Without, it is all planted; within, it is wainscoted, carved, curtained, hung with pictures, and filled with good furniture. 'Tis a passion which survives all others, to deck and improve it. Hither he brings all that is rare and costly, and with the national tendency to sit fast in the same spot for many generations, it comes to be, in the course of time, a museum of heirlooms, gifts, and trophies of the adventures and exploits of the family. He is very fond of silver plate, and, though he have no gallery of portraits of his ancestors. 56. He has of their punch bowls and porringers. Incredible amounts of plate are found in good houses, and the poorest have some spoon or saucepan, gift of a godmother, saved out of better times. An English family consists of a few persons, who, from youth to age, are found revolving within a few feet of each other, as if tied by some invisible ligature, tense as that cartilage which we have seen attaching the two Siamese. England produces under favourable conditions of ease and culture the finest women in the world. And, as the men are affectionate and true-hearted, the women inspire and refine them. Nothing can be more delicate without being fantastical, nothing more firm and based in nature and sentiment, than the courtship and mutual carriage of the sexes. The Song of 1596 says, "The wife of every Englishman is counted blessed." The sentiment of Imogen in Cymbeline is copied from English nature, and not less the Portia of Brutus, the Kate Percy, and the Desdemona. The romance does not exceed the height of noble passion in Mrs. Lucy Hutchinson, or in Lady Russell, or even as one discerns through the plain prose of Pepys's diary, the sacred habit of an English wife. Sir Samuel Romilly could not bear the death of his wife. Every class has its noble and tender examples. Domesticity is the taproot which enables the nation to branch wide and high. The motive and end of their trade and empire is to guard the independence and privacy of their homes. Nothing so much marks their manners as the concentration on their household ties. This domesticity is carried into court and camp. Wellington governed India and Spain and his own troops, and fought battles like a good family man, paid his debts, and, though general of an army in Spain, could not stir abroad for fear of public creditors. This taste for house and parish merits has of course its doting and foolish side. Mr. Cobbett attributes the huge popularity of Perceval, Prime Minister in 1810, to the fact that he was wont to go to church, every Sunday, with a large quarto gilt prayer book under one arm, his wife hanging on the other, and followed by a long brood of children. They keep their old customs, costumes, and pomps, their wig and mace, sceptre, and crown. The Middle Ages still lurk in the streets of London. The Knights of the Bath take oath to defend injured ladies, the gold stick in waiting survives. They repeated the ceremonies of the 11th. 57. Century in the coronation of the present Queen. A hereditary tenure is natural to them. Offices, farms, trades, and traditions descend so. Their leases run for 100 and 1,000 years. Terms of service and partnership are lifelong, or are inherited. "Holdship has been with me," said Lord Eldon, 28 years, knows all my business and books. Antiquity of usage is sanction enough. Wordsworth says of the small freeholders of Westmoreland, many of these humble sons of the hills had a consciousness that the land which they tilled had for more than 500 years been possessed by men of the same name and blood. The ship carpenter in the public yards, my lord's gardener and porter, have been there for more than 100 years, grandfather, father, and son. The English power resides also in their dislike of change. They have difficulty in bringing their reason to act, and on all occasions use their memory first. As soon as they have rid themselves of some grievance, and settled the better practice, they make haste to fix it as a finality, and never wish to hear of alteration more. Every Englishman is an embryonic chancellor, his instinct is to search for a precedent. The favourite phrase of their law is, a custom whereof the memory of man runneth not back to the contrary. The barons say, nolumus mutare, and the cockneys stifle the curiosity of the foreigner. On the reason of any practice, with Lord, Sir, it was always so. They hate innovation. Bacon told them, time was the right reformer, Chatham, that confidence was a plant of slow growth, Canning, to advance with the times, and Wellington, that habit was 10 times nature. All their statesmen learn the irresistibility of the tide of custom, and have invented many fine phrases to cover this slowness of perception, and prehensility of tale. A seashell should be the crest of England, not only because it represents a power built on the waves, but also the hard finish of the men. The Englishman is finished like a cowrie or a murex. After the spire and the spines are formed, or, with the formation, a juice exudes, and a hard enamel varnishes every part. The keeping of the proprieties is as indispensable as clean linen. No merit quite countervails the want of this, whilst this sometimes stands in lieu of all. 'Tis in bad taste, is the most formidable word an Englishman can pronounce. But this Japan 58 costs them dear. There is a prose in certain Englishmen, which exceeds in wooden deadness all rivalry with other countrymen. There is a knell in the conceit and externality of their voice, which seems to say, leave all hope behind. In this Gibraltar of propriety, mediocrity gets entrenched and consolidated and founded in adamant. An Englishman of fashion is like one of those souvenirs, bound in gold vellum, enriched with delicate engravings, on thick hot-pressed paper, fit for the hands of ladies and princes, but with nothing in it worth reading or remembering. A severe decorum rules the court and the cottage. When Tharelberg, the pianist, was one evening performing before the Queen, at Windsor, in a private party, the Queen accompanied him with her voice. The circumstance took air, and all England shuddered from sea to sea. The indecorum was never repeated. Cold, repressive manners prevail. No enthusiasm is permitted except at the opera. They avoid everything marked. They require a tone of voice that excites no attention in the room. Sir Philip Sidney is one of the patron saints of England, of whom Wotton said, his wit was the measure of congruity. Pretension and vapouring are once for all distasteful. They keep to the other extreme of low tone in dress and manners. They avoid pretension and go right to the heart of the thing. They hate nonsense, sentimentalism, and high-flown expression, they use a studied plainness. Even Brummel their fop was marked by the severest simplicity in dress. They value themselves on the absence of everything theatrical in the public business, and on conciseness and going to the point, in private affairs. In an aristocratical country, like England, not the trial by jury, but the dinner is the capital institution. It is the mode of doing honour to a stranger, to invite him to eat, and has been for many 100 years. And they think, says the Venetian traveller of 1500, no greater honour can be conferred or received, than to invite others to eat with them, or to be invited themselves, and they would sooner give 5 or 6 ducats to provide an entertainment for a person, than a groat to assist him in any distress. 7 It is reserved to the end of the day, the family hour being generally 6, in London, and, if any company is expected, 1 or 2 hours later. Every one dresses for dinner, in his own house, or in another. 7 Relation of England. 59. Mans. The guests are expected to arrive within half an hour of the time fixed by card of invitation, and nothing but death or mutilation is permitted to detain them. The English dinner is precisely the model on which our own are constructed in the Atlantic cities. The company sit 1 or 2 hours, before the ladies leave the table. The gentlemen remain over their wine an hour longer, and rejoin the ladies in the drawing room, and take coffee. The dress dinner generates a talent of table talk, which reaches great perfection. The stories are so good, that one is sure they must have been often told before, to have got such happy turns. Hither come all manner of clever projects, bits of popular science, of practical invention, of miscellaneous humor, political, literary, and personal news, railroads, horses, diamonds, agriculture, horticulture, pisciculture, and wine. English stories, bon mots, and the recorded table talk of their wits, are as good as the best of the French. In America, we are apt scholars, but have not yet attained the same perfection, for the range of nations from which London draws, and the steep contrasts of condition create the picturesque in society, as broken country makes picturesque landscape, whilst our prevailing equality makes a prairie tameness, and secondly, because the usage of a dress dinner every day at dark, has a tendency to hive and produce to advantage everything good. Much attrition has worn every sentence into a bullet. Also one meets now and then with polished men, who know everything, have tried everything, can do everything, and are quite superior to letters and science. What could they not, if only they would? 60. Chapter 7. Truth. The Teutonic tribes have a national singleness of heart, which contrasts with races. The German name has a proverbial significance of sincerity and honest meaning. The arts bear testimony to it. The faces of clergy and laity in old sculptures and illuminated missals are charged with earnest belief. Add to this hereditary rectitude the punctuality and precise dealing which commerce creates, and you have the English truth and credit. The government strictly performs its engagements. The subjects do not understand trifling on its part. When any breach of promise occurred, in the old days of prerogative, it was resented by the people as an intolerable grievance. And, in modern times, any slipperiness in the government in political faith, or any repudiation or crookedness in matters of finance, would bring the whole nation to a committee of inquiry and reform. Private men keep their promises, never so trivial. Down goes the flying word on the tablets, and is indelible as Doomsday Book. Their practical power rests on their national sincerity. Veracity derives from instinct, and marks superiority in organization. Nature has endowed some animals with cunning, as a compensation for strength withheld, but it has provoked the malice of all others, as if avengers of public wrong. In the nobler kinds, where strength could be afforded, her races are loyal to truth, as truth is the foundation of the social state. Beasts that make no truce with man, do not break faith with each other. 'Tis said, that the wolf, who makes a cache of his prey, and brings his fellows with him to the spot, if, on digging, it is not found, is instantly and unresistingly torn in pieces. English veracity seems to result on a sounder animal structure, as if they could afford it. They are blunt in saying what they think, sparing of promises, and they require plain dealing of others. We will not have to do with a man in a mask. Let us know the truth. Draw a straight line, hit whom and where it will. Alfred, whom the affection of the nation makes the type of their race, is called by his friend Asser, the truth speaker, Aluretus veridicus. Geoffrey of Monmouth says of King Aurelius, uncle of Arthur, that above all things he hated a lie. The Northman Guthrum said to King 61. Olaf, it is royal work to fulfill royal words. The mottos of their families are monitory proverbs, as, fair fac, say, do, of the Fairfaxes, say and seal, of the House of Fines, vero nil varius, of the de veres. To be king of their word, is their pride. When they unmask cant, they say, the English of this is, and to give the lie is the extreme insult. The phrase of the lowest of the people is honor bright, and their vulgar praise, his word is as good as his bond. They hate shuffling and equivocation, and the cause is damaged in the public opinion, on which any paltering can be fixed. Even Lord Chesterfield, with his French breeding, when he came to define a gentleman, declared that truth made his distinction, and nothing ever spoken by him would find so hearty a suffrage from his nation. The Duke of Wellington, who had the best right to say so, advises the French General Kellerman, that he may rely on the parole of an English officer. The English, of all classes, value themselves on this trait, as distinguishing them from the French, who, in the popular belief, are more polite than true. An Englishman understates, avoids the superlative, checks himself in compliments, alleging, that in the French language, one cannot speak without lying. They love reality in wealth, power, hospitality, and do not easily learn to make a show, and take the world as it goes. They are not fond of ornaments, and if they wear them, they must be gems. They read gladly in old Fuller, that a lady, in the reign of Elizabeth, would have as patiently digested a lie, as the wearing of false stones or pendants of counterfeit pearl. They have the earth hunger, or preference for property in land, which is said to mark the Teutonic nations. They build of stone. Public and private buildings are massive and durable. In comparing their ships' houses, and public offices with the American, it is commonly said, that they spend £1, where we spend $1. Plain rich clothes, plain rich equipage, plain rich finish throughout their house and belongings, mark the English truth. They confide in each other. English believes in English. The French feel the superiority of this probity. The Englishman is not springing a trap for his admiration, but is honestly minding his business. The Frenchman is vain. Madame de Staël says, that the English irritated Napoleon, mainly, because they have found out how to unite success with honesty. She was not aware how wide an application her foreign readers would give to the remark. Wellington discovered the ruin of Bonaparte's affairs, by his 62. own probity. He augured ill of the empire, as soon as he saw that it was mendacious, and lived by war. If war do not bring in its sequel new trade, better agriculture and manufactures, but only games, fireworks and spectacles, no prosperity could support it, much less, a nation decimated for conscripts, and out of pocket, like France. So he drudged for years on his military works at Lisbon, and from this base at last extended his gigantic lines to Waterloo, believing in his countrymen and their syllogisms above all the rhodomantade of Europe. At a St. George's Festival, in Montreal, where I happened to be a guest, since my return home, I observed that the chairman complimented his compatriots, by saying, they confided that wherever they met an Englishman, they found a man who would speak the truth. And one cannot think this festival fruitless, if, all over the world, on the 2-3 of April, wherever 2 or 3 English are found, they meet to encourage each other in the nationality of veracity. In the power of saying rude truth, sometimes in the lion's mouth, no men surpass them. On the king's birthday, when each bishop was expected to offer the king a purse of gold, Latimer gave Henry VIII a copy of the Vulgate, with a mark at the passage, whoremongers and adulterers God will judge, and they so honor stoutness in each other, that the king passed it over. They are tenacious of their belief, and cannot easily change their opinions to suit the hour. They are like ships with too much head on to come quickly about, nor will prosperity or even adversity be allowed to shake their habitual view of conduct. Whilst I was in London, M. Guizot arrived there on his escape from Paris, in February, 1848. Many private friends called on him. His name was immediately proposed as an honorary member of the Athenaeum. M. Guizot was blackballed. Certainly, they knew the distinction of his name. But the Englishman is not fickle. He had really made up his mind, now for years as he read his newspaper, to hate and despise M. Guizot, and the altered position of the man as an illustrious exile, and a guest in the country, make no difference to him, as they would instantly, to an American. They require the same adherence, thorough conviction, and reality in public men. It is the want of character which makes the low reputation of the Irish members. See them, they said, 127 all voting like sheep, never proposing anything, and all but for. 63. Voting the income tax, which was an ill-judged concession of the government, relieving Irish property from the burdens charged on English. They have a horror of adventurers in or out of Parliament. The ruling passion of Englishmen, in these days, is a terror of humbug. In the same proportion, they value honesty, stoutness, and adherence to your own. They like a man committed to his objects. They hate the French, as frivolous, they hate the Irish, as aimless, they hate the Germans, as professors. In February, 1848, they said, "Look, the French king and his party fell for want of a shot, they had not conscience to shoot, so entirely was the pith and heart of monarchy eaten out." They attack their own politicians every day, on the same grounds, as adventurers. They love stoutness in standing for your right, in declining money or promotion that costs any concession. The barrister refuses the silk gown of Queen's Counsel, if his junior have it one day earlier. Lord Collingwood would not accept his medal for victory on February 14, 1797, if he did not receive one for victory on June 1, 1794, and the long withholden medal was accorded. When Castlereagh dissuaded Lord Wellington from going to the King's levee, until the unpopular Sintra business had been explained, he replied, "You furnish me a reason for going. I will go to this, or I will never go to a King's levee." The radical mob at Oxford cried after the Tory Lord Eldon, "There's old Eldon, cheer him, he never ratted." They have given the parliamentary nickname of Trimmerstow the time servers, whom English character does not love. 8. They are very liable in their politics to extraordinary delusions, thus, to believe what stands recorded in the gravest books, that the movement of April 10, 1848, was urged or assisted by foreigners, which, to be sure, is paralleled by the democratic whimsy in this country, which I have noticed to be shared by men sane on other points, that the English are at the bottom of the agitation of slavery, in American politics, and then again to the French popular legends on the subject of perfidious Albion. But suspicion will make fools of nations as of citizens. 8. It is an unlucky moment to remember these sparkles of solitary virtue in the face of the honours lately paid in England to the Emperor Louis Napoleon. I am sure that no Englishman whom I had the happiness to know, consented, when the aristocracy and the commons of London cringed like a Neapolitan rabble, before a successful thief. But how to resist one step, though odious, in a linked series of state necessities? Governments must always learn too late, that the use of dishonest agents is as ruinous for nations as for single men. 64. A slow temperament makes them less rapid and ready than other countrymen, and has given occasion to the observation, that English wit comes afterwards, which the French denote as esprit d'escalier. This dullness makes their attachment to home, and their adherence in all foreign countries to home habits. The Englishman who visits Mount Etna, will carry his tea kettle to the top. The old Italian author of The Relation of England, in 1500, says, "I have it on the best information, that, when the war is actually raging most furiously, they will seek for good eating, and all their other comforts, without thinking what harm might befall them. Then their eyes seem to be set at the bottom of a tunnel, and they affirm the one small fact they know, with the best faith in the world that nothing else exists. And, as their own belief in guineas is perfect, they readily, on all occasions, apply the pecuniary argument as final. Thus when the Rochester rappings began to be heard of in England, a man deposited £100 in a sealed box in the Dublin Bank, and then advertised in the newspapers to all somnambulists, mesmerizers, and others, that whoever could tell him the number of his note, should have the money. He let it lie there 6 months, the newspapers now and then, at his instance, stimulating the attention of the adepts, but none could ever tell him, and he said, 'Now let me never be bothered more with this proven lie.' It is told of a good Sir John, that he heard a case stated by counsel, and made up his mind, then the counsel for the other side taking their turn to speak, he found himself so unsettled and perplexed, that he exclaimed, so help me God. I will never listen to evidence again. Any number of delightful examples of this English stolidity are the anecdotes of Europe. I knew a very worthy man, a magistrate, I believe he was, in the town of Derby, who went to the opera, to see Molly Brown. In one scene, the heroine was to rush across a ruined bridge. Mr. B arose, and mildly yet firmly called the attention of the audience and the performers to the fact, that, in his judgment, the bridge was unsafe. This English stolidity contrasts with French wit and tact. The French, it is commonly said, have greatly more influence in Europe than the English. What influence the English have is by brute force of wealth and power, that of the French by affinity and talent. The Italian is subtle, the Spaniard treacherous, tortures, it was said, could never wrest from an Egyptian the confession of a secret. None of these traits belong to the Englishman. His choler and conceit force everything out. Defoe, who knew his countrymen well, says of them. 65. In close intrigue, their faculties but weak, for generally whatever they know, they speak, and often their own counsels undermine by mere infirmity without design. From whence, the learned say, it doth proceed, that English treasons never can succeed, for they're so open-hearted, you may know their own most secret thoughts, and others too. 66. Chapter 8. Character. The English race are reputed morose. I do not know that they have sadder brows than their neighbors of northern climates. They are sad by comparison with the singing and dancing nations, not sadder, but slow and staid, as finding their joys at home. They, too, believe that where there is no enjoyment of life, there can be no vigor and art in speech or thought, that your merry heart goes all the way, your sad one tires in a mile. This trait of gloom has been fixed on them by French travellers, who, from Froissart, Voltaire, Le Sage, Mirabeau, down to the lively journalists of the feuilletons, have spent their wit on the solemnity of their neighbours. The French say, gay conversation is unknown in their island. The Englishman finds no relief from reflection, except in reflection. When he wishes for amusement, he goes to work. His hilarity is like an attack of fever. Religion, the theatre, and the reading the books of his country, all feed and increase his natural melancholy. The police does not interfere with public diversions. It thinks itself bound in duty to respect the pleasures and rare gaiety of this inconsolable nation, and their well-known courage is entirely attributable to their disgust of life. I suppose, their gravity of demeanor and their few words have obtained this reputation. As compared with the Americans, I think them cheerful and contented. Young people, in this country, are much more prone to melancholy. The English have a mild aspect, and a ringing cheerful voice. They are large-natured, and not so easily amused as the Southerners, and are among them as grown people among children, requiring war, or trade, or engineering, or science, instead of frivolous games. They are proud and private, and, even if disposed to recreation, will avoid an open garden. They sported sadly, ils s'amusent tristement, selon la coutume de leur pays, said Froissart, and, I suppose, never nation built their party walls so thick, or their garden fences so high. Meat and wine produce no effect on them, they are just as cold, quiet, and composed, at the end, as at the beginning of dinner. The reputation of taciturnity they have enjoyed for 600 or 700 years, and a kind of pride in bad public speaking is noted in the House of Commons, as if they were willing to show that they did not live by their 67 tongues, or thought they spoke well enough if they had the tone of gentlemen. In mixed company, they shut their mouths. A Yorkshire mill owner told me, he had ridden more than once all the way from London to Leeds, in the first-class carriage, with the same persons, and no word exchanged. The clubhouses were established to cultivate social habits, and it is rare that more than two eat together, and oftenest one eats alone. Was it then a stroke of humour in the serious Swedenborg, or was it only his pitiless logic, that made him shut up the English souls in a heaven by themselves? They are contradictorily described as sour, splenetic, and stubborn, and as mild, sweet, and sensible. The truth is, they have great range and variety of character. Commerce sends abroad multitudes of different classes. The choleric Welshman, the fervid Scot, the bilious resident in the East or West Indies, are wide of the perfect behavior of the educated and dignified man of family. So is the burly farmer, so is the country squire, with his narrow and violent life. In every inn, is the commercial room, in which travellers, or bagmen who carry patterns, and solicit orders, for the manufacturers, are wont to be entertained. It easily happens that this class should characterize England to the foreigner, who meets them on the road, and at every public house, whilst the gentry avoid the taverns, or seclude themselves whilst in them. But these classes are the right English stock, and may fairly show the national qualities, before yet art and education have dealt with them. They are good lovers, good haters, slow but obstinate admirers, and, in all things, very much steeped in their temperament, like men hardly awaked from deep sleep, which they enjoy. Their habits and instincts cleave to nature. They are of the earth, earthy, and of the sea, as the sea kinds, attached to it for what it yields them, and not from any sentiment. They are full of coarse strength, rude exercise, butcher's meat, and sound sleep, and suspect any poetic insinuation or any hint for the conduct of life which reflects on this animal existence, as if somebody were fumbling at the umbilical cord and might stop their supplies. They doubt a man's sound judgment, if he does not eat with appetite, and shake their heads if he is particularly chaste. Take them as they come, you shall find in the common people a surly indifference, sometimes gruffness and ill temper, and, in minds of more power, magazines of inexhaustible war, challenging. 68. The ruggedest hour that time and spite dare bring. To frown upon the enraged Northumberland. They are headstrong believers and defenders of their opinion, and not less resolute in maintaining their whim and perversity. Hezekiah Woodward wrote a book against the Lord's Prayer. And one can believe that Burton the anatomist of melancholy, having predicted from the stars the hour of his death, slipped the knot himself round his own neck, not to falsify his horoscope. Their looks bespeak an invincible stoutness, they have extreme difficulty to run away, and will die game. Wellington said of the young coxcombs of the lifeguards delicately brought up, but the puppies fight well, and Nelson said of his sailors, they really mind shot no more than peas. Of absolute stoutness no nation has more or better examples. They are good at storming redoubts, at boarding frigates, at dying in the last ditch, or any desperate service which has daylight and honor in it, but not, I think, at enduring the rack, or any passive obedience, like jumping off a castle roof at the word of a czar. Being both vascular and highly organized, so as to be very sensible of pain, and intellectual, so as to see reason and glory in a matter. Of that constitutional force, which yields the supplies of the day, they have the more than enough, the excess which creates courage on fortitude, genius in poetry, invention in mechanics, enterprise in trade, magnificence in wealth, splendor in ceremonies, petulance and projects in youth. The young men have a rude health which runs into peccant humours. They drink brandy like water, cannot expend their quantities of waste strength on riding, hunting, swimming, and fencing, and run into absurd frolics with the gravity of the Eumenides. They stoutly carry into every nook and corner of the earth their turbulent sense, leaving no lie uncontradicted, no pretension unexamined. They chew hashish, cut themselves with poisoned creases, swing their hammock in the boughs of the bohan upas, taste every poison, buy every secret. At Naples, they put St. Januarius's blood in an alembic, they saw a hole into the head of the winking Virgin, to know why she winks, measure with an English foot rule every cell of the Inquisition, every Turkish Kaaba, every Holy of Holies, translate and send to Bentley the arcanum bribed and bullied away from shuddering Brahmins, and measure their own strength by the 69. Terror they cause. These travellers are of every class, the best and the worst, and it may easily happen that those of rudest behaviour are taken notice of and remembered. The Saxon melancholy in the vulgar rich and poor appears as gushes of ill humour, which every check exasperates into sarcasm and vituperation. There are multitudes of rude young English who have the self-sufficiency and bluntness of their nation, and who, with their disdain of the rest of mankind, and with this indigestion and choler, have made the English traveller a proverb for uncomfortable and offensive manners. It was no bad description of the Briton generically, what was said 200 years ago, of one particular Oxford scholar: he was a very bold man, uttered anything that came into his mind, not only among his companions, but in public coffee houses, and would often speak his mind of particular persons then accidentally present, without examining the company he was in, for which he was often reprimanded, and several times threatened to be kicked and beaten. The common Englishman is prone to forget a cardinal article in the Bill of Social Rights, that every man has a right to his own ears. No man can claim to usurp more than a few cubic feet of the audibilities of a public room, or to put upon the company with the loud statement of his crotchets or personalities. But it is in the deep traits of race that the fortunes of nations are written, and however derived, whether a happier tribe or mixture of tribes, the air or what circumstance, that mixed for them the golden mean of temperament, here exists the best stock in the world, broad-fronted, broad-bottomed, best for depth, range, and equability, men of aplomb and reserves, great range, and many moods, strong instincts, yet apt for culture, war class as well as clerks, earls and tradesmen, wise minority, as well as foolish majority, abysmal temperament, hiding wells of wrath, and glooms on which no sunshine settles, alternated with a common sense and humanity which hold them fast to every piece of cheerful duty, making this temperament a sea to which all storms are superficial, a race to which their fortunes flow, as if they alone had the elastic organization at once fine and robust enough for dominion, as if the burly inexpressive, now mute and contumacious, now fierce and sharp-tongued dragon, which once made the island light with his fiery breath, had bequeathed his ferocity to his conqueror. They hide virtues under vices, or the semblance of them. It is the misshapen hairy Scandinavian troll again. 70. Who lifts the cart out of the mire, or threshes the corn that 10-day labourers could not end, but it is done in the dark, and with muttered maledictions. He is a churl with a soft place in his heart, whose speech is a brash of bitter waters, but who loves to help you at a pinch. He says no, and serves you, and your thanks disgust him. Here was lately a cross-grained miser, odd and ugly, resembling in countenance the portrait of Punch, with the laugh left out, rich by his own industry, sulking in a lonely house, who never gave a dinner to any man, and disdained all courtesies, yet as true a worshipper of beauty in form and colour as ever existed, and profusely poring over the cold mind of his countrymen creations of grace and truth, removing the reproach of sterility from English art, catching from their savage climate every fine hint, and importing into their galleries every tint and trait of sunnier cities and skies, making an era in painting, and, when he saw that the splendour of one of his pictures in the exhibition dimmed his rivals that hung next it, secretly took a brush and blackened his own. They do not wear their heart in their sleeve for daws to peck it. They have that phlegm or staidness, which it is a compliment to disturb. Great men, said Aristotle, are always of a nature originally melancholy. 'Tis the habit of a mind which attaches to abstractions with a passion which gives vast results. They dare to displease, they do not speak to expectation. They like the sayers of no, better than the sayers of yes. Each of them has an opinion which he feels it becomes him to express all the more that it differs from yours. They are meditating opposition. This gravity is inseparable from minds of great resources. There is an English hero superior to the French, the German, the Italian, or the Greek. When he is brought to the strife with fate, he sacrifices a richer material possession, and on more purely metaphysical grounds. He is there with his own consent, face to face with fortune, which he defies. On deliberate choice, and from grounds of character, he has elected his part to live and die for, and dies with grandeur. This race has added new elements to humanity, and has a deeper root in the world. They have great range of scale, from ferocity to exquisite refinement. With larger scale, they have great retrieving power. After running each tendency to an extreme, they try another tack with equal heat. More intellectual than other races, when they live with other races, they do not. 71. Take their language, but bestow their own. They subsidize other nations, and are not subsidized. They proselyte, and are not proselyte. They assimilate other races to themselves, and are not assimilated. The English did not calculate the conquest of the Indies. It fell to their character. So they administer in different parts of the world, the codes of every empire and race, in Canada, Old French law, in the Mauritius, the Code Napoleon, in the West Indies, the edicts of the Spanish Cortes, in the East Indies, the laws of Menu, in the Isle of Man, of the Scandinavian Thing, at the Cape of Good Hope, of the Old Netherlands, and in the Ionian Islands, the Pandects of Justinian. They are very conscious of their advantageous position in history. England is the lawgiver, the patron, the instructor, the ally. Compare the tone of the French and of the English press, the first querulous, captious, sensitive about English opinion. The English press is never timorous about French opinion, but arrogant and contemptuous. They are testy and headstrong through an excess of will and bias, churlish as men sometimes please to be, who do not forget a debt, who ask no favors, and who will do what they like with their own. With education and intercourse, these asperities wear off, and leave the goodwill pure. If anatomy is reformed according to national tendencies, I suppose, the spleen will hereafter be found in the Englishman, not found in the American, and differencing the one from the other. I anticipate another anatomical discovery, that this organ will be found to be cortical and caducous, that they are superficially morose, but at last tender-hearted, herein differing from Rome and the Latin nations. Nothing savage, nothing mean resides in the English heart. They are subject to panics of credulity and of rage, but the temper of the nation, however disturbed, settles itself soon and easily, as, in this temperate zone, the sky after whatever storms clears again, and serenity is its normal condition. A saving stupidity masks and protects their perception as the curtain of the eagle's eye. Our swifter Americans, when they first deal with English, pronounce them stupid, but, later, do them justice as people who wear well, or hide their strength. To understand the power of performance that is in their finest wits, in the patient Newton, or in the versatile transcendent poets, or in the Dugdales, Gibbons, Hallam's, Eldons, and 72. Peels, one should see how English day labourers hold out. High and low, they are of an unctuous texture. There is an adipocere in their constitution, as if they had oil also for their mental wheels, and could perform vast amounts of work without damaging themselves. Even the scale of expense on which people live, and to which scholars and professional men conform, proves the tension of their muscle, when vast numbers are found who can each lift this enormous load. I might even add, their daily feasts argue a savage vigor of body. No nation was ever so rich in able men, gentlemen, as Charles I said of Strafford, whose abilities might make a prince rather afraid than ashamed in the greatest affairs of state, men of such temper, that, like Baron Vere, had one seen him returning from a victory, he would by his silence have suspected that he had lost the day, and, had he beheld him in a retreat, he would have collected him a conqueror by the cheerfulness of his spirit. 9. The following passage from the Heimskringla might almost stand as a portrait of the modern Englishman. Halder was very stout and strong, and remarkably handsome in appearances. King Harold gave him this testimony, that he, among all his men, cared least about doubtful circumstances, whether they betokened danger or pleasure, for, whatever turned up, he was never in higher nor in lower spirits, never slept less nor more on account of them, nor ate nor drank but according to his custom. Halder was not a man of many words, but short in conversation, told his opinion bluntly, and was obstinate and hard, and this could not please the king, who had many clever people about him, zealous in his service. Halder remained a short time with the king, and then came to Iceland, where he took up his abode in Hjardaholt, and dwelt in that farm to a very advanced age. 10. The national temper, in the civil history, is not flashy or whiffling. The slow, deep English mass smoulders with fire, which at last sets all its borders in flame. The wrath of London is not French wrath, but has a long memory, and, in its hottest heat, a register and rule. 9 Fuller. Worthies of England. 10 Heimskringla, Lang's translation, Vol. 3 p. 37. 73. Half their strength they put not forth. They are capable of a sublime resolution, and if hereafter the war of races, often predicted, and making itself a war of opinions also, a question of despotism and liberty coming from Eastern Europe, should menace the English civilization, these sea kings may take once again to their floating castles, and find a new home and a second millennium of power in their colonies. The stability of England is the security of the modern world. If the English race were as mutable as the French, what reliance? But the English stand for liberty. The conservative, money-loving, lord-loving English are yet liberty-loving, and so freedom is safe, for they have more personal force than any other people. The nation always resist the immoral action of their government. They think humanely on the affairs of France, of Turkey, of Poland, of Hungary, of Schleswig-Holstein, though overborne by the statecraft of the rulers at last. Does the early history of each tribe show the permanent bias, which, though not less potent, is masked, as the tribe spreads its activity into colonies, commerce, codes, arts, letters? The early history shows it, as the musician plays the air which he proceeds to conceal in a tempest of variations. In Alfred, in the Northman, one may read the genius of the English society, namely, that private life is the place of honor. Glory, a career, and ambition, words familiar to the longitude of Paris, are seldom heard in English speech. Nelson wrote from their hearts his homely telegraph, England expects every man to do his duty. For actual service, for the dignity of a profession, or to appease diseased or inflamed talent, the army and navy may be entered, the worst boys doing well in the navy, and the civil service, in departments where serious official work is done, and they hold in esteem the barrister engaged in the severer studies of the law. But the calm, sound, and most British Britain shrinks from public life as charlatanism and respects an economy founded on agriculture, coal mines, manufactures, or trade, which secures an independence through the creation of real values. They wish neither to command or obey, but to be kings in their own houses. They are intellectual and deeply enjoy literature. They like well to have the world served up to them in books, maps, models, and every mode of exact information, and, though not creators in art, they value its refinement. They are ready for leisure, can direct and fill their own day. 74. Nor need so much as others the constraint of a necessity. But the history of the nation discloses, at every turn, this original predilection for private independence, and, however this inclination may have been disturbed by the bribes with which their vast colonial power has warped men out of orbit, the inclination endures and forms and reforms the laws, letters, manners, and occupations. They choose that welfare which is compatible with the commonwealth, knowing that such alone is stable, as wise merchants prefer investments in the 3%. 75. Chapter 9. Cocaine. The English are a nation of humorists. Individual right is pushed to the uttermost bound compatible with public order. Property is so perfect, that it seems the craft of that race, and not to exist elsewhere. The king cannot step on an acre which the peasant refuses to sell. A testator endows a dog or a rookery, and Europe cannot interfere with his absurdity. Every individual has his particular way of living, which he pushes to folly, and the decided sympathy of his compatriots is engaged to back up Mr. Crump's whim by statutes, and chancellors, and horse guards. There is no freak so ridiculous but some Englishman has attempted to immortalize by money and law. British citizenship is as omnipotent as Roman was. Mr. Cockayne is very sensible of this. The pursy man means by freedom the right to do as he pleases, and does wrong in order to feel his freedom, and makes a conscience of persisting in it. He is intensely patriotic, for his country is so small. His confidence in the power and performance of his nation makes him provokingly incurious about other nations. He dislikes foreigners. Swedenborg, who lived much in England, notes the similitude of minds among the English, in consequence of which they contract familiarity with friends who are of that nation, and seldom with others, and they regard foreigners, as one looking through a telescope from the top of a palace regards those who dwell or wander about out of the city. A much older traveller, the Venetian who wrote the Relation of England, 11 in 1500, says the English are great lovers of themselves, and of everything belonging to them. They think that there are no other men than themselves, and no other world but England, and, whenever they see a handsome foreigner, they say that he looks like an Englishman, and it is a great pity he should not be an Englishman, and whenever they partake of any delicacy with a foreigner, they ask him whether such a thing is made in his country. When he adds epithets of praise, his climax is so English, and when he wishes to pay you the highest compliment, he says, "I should not know you from an Englishman." France is, by its natural contrast, a kind of 11 printed by the Camden Society. 76. Blackboard on which English character draws its own traits in chalk. This arrogance habitually exhibits itself in allusions to the French. I suppose that all men of English blood in America, Europe, or Asia, have a secret feeling of joy that they are not French natives. Mr. Coleridge is said to have given public thanks to God, at the close of a lecture, that he had defended him from being able to utter a single sentence in the French language. I have found that Englishmen have such a good opinion of England, that the ordinary phrases, in all good society, of postponing or disparaging one's own things in talking with a stranger, are seriously mistaken by them for an insuppressible homage to the merits of their nation, and the New Yorker or Pennsylvanian who modestly laments the disadvantage of a new country, log huts, and savages, is surprised by the instant and unfeigned commiseration of the whole company, who plainly account all the world out of England a heap of rubbish. The same insular limitation pinches his foreign politics. He sticks to his traditions and usages, and, so help him God, he will force his island by laws down the throat of great countries like India, China, Canada, Australia, and not only so, but impose whopping on the Congress of Vienna, and trample down all nationalities with his taxed boots. Lord Chatham goes for liberty, and no taxation without representation, for that is British law, but not a hobnail shall they dare make in America, but buy their nails in England, for that also is British law, and the fact that British commerce was to be recreated by the independence of America, took them all by surprise. In short, I am afraid that English nature is so rank and aggressive as to be a little incompatible with every other. The world is not wide enough for two. But, beyond this nationality, it must be admitted, the island offers a daily worship to the Old Norse god Brage,